No, no Mario and no Jason. So 4 of us. Commissioner McKinnon, can you join us, please? No, I think this is it.
Jennifer's not coming? I think Jennifer is coming. Is Jennifer coming? Where's Jennifer? I can't start.
No, because Nina's sitting next to Leslie. Oh, should I wait? So we are waiting for Jennifer.
I think we are waiting for Jennifer. Carl, is Jennifer coming?
You know what? We're going to get started. She's not here right now.
The chair is cutting the chair is cutting her dead.
Do we have a quorum? Yes. Yeah. Can I go?
2 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. I'd like to call the regular meeting of the Planning Commission of Wednesday, August 2nd to order. Paula, would you like to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We have the roll call, please.
Commissioner Fresco? Here. Commissioner Kennedy? Absent. Commissioner Lambert?
Here.
Commissioner McKinnon?
Present.
And Chair Anderson.
Here. Planning Director's report, please.
Good evening, Commission. So this will be our only meeting in August. The August 16th meeting has been canceled. September 6th, we have a regular meeting. We'll have a discussion about parking and management. And then there's a CUP variance for 2953 Delaware, which is a child care facility. And then 2 alcohol CUPs, one at 214 Wilshire, which is a wine store restaurant, and then one at the Broad Stage at 1310 11th. September 13th, 2 DAs, 1430 Lincoln and 1325 6. So those are the 2 related to the fire station swap. And then a CUP for auto rental at 2703 Santa Monica. I think it's the Enterprise car rental. So, and then October 4th and 18th are the meetings in October. We don't have items scheduled yet, but I wanted to note that that's October 4th will be the first night that we're at the library. So I think, as most of you know, they're going to be doing some work in the council chambers. So all of the meetings, other than council meetings, will be off-site. For what, a couple, 3 months or so? Yeah. End of the year. So we'll be at the main library auditorium. There will be live TV, and also they will stay open till at least 11. So we won't have have to leave at 9 o'clock when the speaker starts going off that you get sometimes at the library. But they are prepared to allow us to stay there at least till 11 and even past 11 if necessary. And that concludes my report.
Okay. Commissioner Lambert.
I have a question about the pipeline report we get every meeting or every month or whatever it is. How often is that updated? Monthly? So if we begin to see the pipeline projects that are going to come in under the new inclusionary, the 20% inclusionary, would we see that very soon?
It would be reflected in the report. Yeah, we update it pretty much like last week of every month. So as applications convert or come in or change or what have you, we update that sheet.
Okay, and then in any housing applications that come in under the new inclusionary requirements, we would also see.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
And we could also highlight those for you.
That would be wonderful. I don't think it'll take long, but thank you.
Commissioner Fresco.
On that note, would we see the ones that are administrative approval, since so many of them would be now?
Yes, we track all new construction on that sheet, including
Okay.
administrative approvals.
And Commissioner McKinnon.
So my question is about August the 16th, where we had the 2 DAs. What happened to put them back a month?
As we didn't get all the required information in time, specifically the revisions to the development agreements, because we had ongoing negotiations. So, we're kind of working on getting all the terms finalized. So it got pushed back a month.
Even though we've had years to do this, right?
It's been
Okay, thank you.
Item 5, are there any planning commissioner announcements? Commissioner McKinnon.
Yes, I attended a very well put on event on Sunday at 17th Street, which I hope is the first of the Mobility Action Plan efforts, where one of our mobility division's finest, Laura, was there looking at the new bike and walking track between the station and the college, and I hope that we will replicate the success of that event with the number of residents across the city over the next year at an accelerated rate as part of this mobility action plan we're going to put together, David.
All right. Item 6 is approval of the minutes. Do I have a motion to approve? Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposition? Abstentions? Okay, motion passes. And those are the minutes of May 18th. We also have a STOA to approve.
I have some comments on it. Oh, it doesn't say it's on it is on consent, so I want to pull it off of consent.
Right. I guess that's the way we need to do that. Okay. Do we need a staff report, or do you
No,
wanna just- okay.
Well, no, we don't.
Okay.
On page 19, condition 23A, it says the final project should retain all existing roof lines and eaves as shown on project plans dated March 31st. And my understanding was that we wanted the project design to retain all the project eaves in addition to the ones shown on those plans. That was my understanding. So I would take out as shown on project plans.
Staff have any concerns about that change?
I believe that's what we discussed. It was in. What? Right, so then it's not the way it is on the plans. It's the way it is as built, the eaves that exist.
okay. That's fine.
And then I have one other little thing regarding 23D about the shutters. I just wanted to say for the record that after that meeting, I went on the library website and I did find a picture from 1951, which I forwarded to the consultant and staff, that showed more shutters than exist now, although not all of the shutters that we wondered about, but it certainly was more evidence and documentation. So I just wanted that to be part of the record that that happened.
Commissioner McKinnon, do you?
No, sorry.
Okay. Commissioner Fresco, would you like to make a motion?
So I would move to approve the STOA for 423, 429 Ocean Avenue with the change to condition 23A.
Okay.
Chair, I don't think you can actually pass that tonight because I wasn't at that meeting. So there's only three of you
Good
present.
point.
Okay.
So I move that we continue.
We can't vote on that either.
No, we can't.
We don't have to make a motion to continue, right? It'll
No.
just roll over. Okay. Thank you. We can make those adjustments for when it comes back to us too. Okay. Let's see. Item 8A is the preliminary discussion of zoning ordinance policy issues. Welcome. That's me. Hold on. Okay.
Good evening, Commissioners. Tony Kim, Principal Planner. I'm very happy to be back to continue our zoning ordinance update saga. Just some background to get you refreshed as to where we are in the process. On August 3rd of last year, the Commission organized the policy issues that we had gathered to date into 3 groups or buckets. The first being the policy issues that were considered minor changes, corrections, and clarifications. The second being policy issues that have arisen since the adoption of the zoning ordinance through its implementation, and the third being new policy issues. In September of last year, the Commission reviewed the recommendations for Bucket 1, along with some changes to the accessory dwelling unit standards to the Council, which in February of this year, the Council adopted those changes. So tonight, we are here to address the policy issues that have arisen since the adoption of the zoning ordinance, and that would be the Bucket 2 items, which are listed as issues number 16 through 33 in the index in attachment A of the staff report that you received. Tonight is just a preliminary discussion and review of those Bucket 2 topics. What we're hoping to get is some direction from the Commission as to how to approach these policy options and get some recommendations so that we can return with more analysis and some proposed red lines for these policy topics. We would get that direction from Commission and then come back with a resolution of intention so that we could formally begin the process to make any potential modifications to the ordinance related to these Bucket 2 topics. So the issues that are listed in the staff report for these Bucket 2 issues are broken down into what the policy topic is, the purpose of this standard, how the issue was identified, and some potential initial policy options for the Commission to consider. Now, these aren't exhaustive options. The Commission is more than welcome to provide other recommendations or suggestions. So with that, I can begin going through each topic. If there are any topics that the Commission feels they don't need to hear me talk about, you can just tell me to skip it, or if you need a break at any point during this presentation, that's fine too. But I will try to get through as quickly as I can. So topic number 16 is in regards to revisiting the appropriateness of the minimum 15-foot first-story street wall height for projects. The purpose of that standard is to provide pedestrian-oriented ground floor design, allow for a variety of commercial uses on the ground floor, and provide consistent design patterns on the commercial boulevards. What architects and developers have found is that this standard can be challenging for parcels with sloping conditions, and it's difficult to achieve that minimum 15-foot first-story street wall height, as well as also try to meet the maximum 20-foot height. So there has been some discussion about looking at whether that standard is appropriate. And some initial policy options include lowering that minimum first-story street wall height requirement, possibly requiring that that street wall height only apply to the primary street frontage for corner parcels, or to maintain the existing standard and allow for applicants to apply for major modifications, which is the existing process that we have. Number 17 is in regards to the limit in the code on skylight projections above the roof. Currently, that's a maximum of 12 inches. This allows for the installation of skylight fixtures to allow access to daylight, but it also minimizes their aesthetic projections above the roof. Some architects and property owners have claimed that this 12-inch maximum is too limiting, especially with the variety of design of skylights, and some that are operable and open, some that are shaped to allow light in certain ways. So basically, it's to look at this current standard of the 12-inch maximum Some initial policy options are to increase the skylight projection limit, also to consider a limit to the maximum roof area that can be utilized for skylights, and also one option is to maintain the existing standard. Number 18 is to clarify the affordability levels of deed restricted units for Tier 2 projects, and that they should be dictated by objective housing needs. In the community benefits section of the code, Tier 2 projects are required to provide 50% more affordable housing, and that these units are affordable to between 30% and 80% income households. Recent housing projects, you probably have noticed, applicants are choosing to provide 7.5% of the units to 30% income households. What they're doing is choosing the option that provides the lowest percentage of units, affordable units in the project, regardless of what the city deems is necessary. But they are choosing that option because it's the least amount of affordable units that they have to provide. Some initial policy options are to add a requirement that allows for the consideration of how the affordable units meet objective housing needs. And another option is to perhaps defer any modifications to this section until a more comprehensive review of the affordable housing production program is undertaken. Number 19 is fairly simple. It's to make minor modifications to the landscaping section of the zoning ordinance to be consistent with Chapter 8.108 of the Municipal Code. That is the green building landscape design, resource conservation, and construction and demolition waste management standards. Staff would like to make just a few minor corrections to Chapter 926 so that the terminology is consistent with the recently approved changes to the green building ordinance. Number 20 is to clarify what a non-conforming use may be allowed, or to clarify that a non-conforming use may be allowed in a city-designated historic resource only if the non-conforming use was the predominant use at the site when it was in operation. This standard is intended to provide an incentive for the adaptive reuse of city-designated historic resources based on uses that were previously existing at the site. We have seen recently applicants who have tried to take advantage of this standard by providing evidence that a prior non-conforming use, even though it was just a tiny portion of the building as a prior non-conforming use, gives them the right to bring that use back into the building. And so what we'd like to do is clarify the language so that it makes sure that the previous use was the predominant use in the historic resource. So that's number 20. 21 is to consider the single-family residential standard that requires an addition of 50% or more to the residence, or 500 feet, whichever is greater, triggers the threshold for the applicant to bring all of their parking, loading, and circulation standards up to conformance with the new code. So for example, this is just a simple schematic where if you have an existing 887 square foot house with an existing non-conforming 284 square foot garage, this is actually a real example that we had earlier, and somebody proposed a modest addition that was slightly over 50% of the existing house, that would trigger the applicant to have to bring all of their parking standards into conformance, meaning a standard sized driveway. In this case, there was an existing substandard width driveway. The garage itself would have to be brought into conformance to provide 2 parking spaces. So it's an onerous standard for some of these smaller homes, and has led to owners choosing to demolish their existing home as opposed to dealing with the limitations on what they can add before having to bring their parking into conformance. So some initial policy options to consider is to change that existing percentage or size area threshold. Some terminology can be added to specify that this only applies to the R1 district, which is actually the way the standard was in the previous zoning ordinance. but now it applies to all single unit dwellings regardless of the district. And also add a provision to exempt R1 single unit properties that conform with all the parking standards except for the requirement to take access from the alley. So that's a little more nuanced, but these are some of the options to look at that issue. Number 22 is to distinguish the use categories in R1 and OP districts where enclosed parking may not be required. Currently, the standard requires all single unit dwellings to provide, all structures in single unit districts to provide parking within enclosed garages. So what that does, there's certain land use categories in single unit dwellings such as duplexes or adult daycare, supportive housing, and schools, which the way the code is currently written, their minimum required parking would all have to be enclosed in the R1 districts. And so the thought is perhaps that's a little too strict, given that there are other types of uses that could be permitted in R1 districts. So some initial policy options are to change that requirement so that perhaps only additional parking above and beyond the minimum required parking being closed, or to perhaps remove the enclosed garage requirement for any uses that aren't single unit dwellings, and allow uncovered parking for other uses. Those are a couple options to consider. Number 23 regards minimum driveway widths in relation to the minimum apron widths for the driveways. This standard sets guidelines for appropriate driveway apron widths based on the widths of driveways that are consistent with the Santa Monica Public Works standards. However, it appears that the standards in the zoning ordinance aren't completely consistent with the standards in the Public Works section of the municipal code. So this modification would attempt to provide some consistency between the zoning standards and the Public Works standards. In some cases, the code allows a driveway apron to be narrower than the driveway itself. So this modification would fix that inconsistency. So the initial policy options would be to match the guidelines in the code with the Public Works standards, and also to perhaps coordinate with Public Works to establish new guidelines for these driveway aprons. Number 24 regards the applicability of the bike parking section, which appears to have an inadvertent conjunction connecting the instances when bike parking is required. That standard is to increase the availability of bike parking when significant investment is made to a property. The way it's worded now, it says that every new building, change of use, and every building enlarged by 10% must provide these minimum parking standards. We've had applicants who have argued that since they don't meet all three of those applicability standards, they're not subject to these bike parking minimums. So the policy option is to correct that "and" with an "or" so that any of those three situations would require additional bike parking. Another policy option is to perhaps not require it for changes of use or building additions, but that is not a recommended policy option. Yeah, it's an option. Number 25 is to determine when required bike parking should be allowed on the public right-of-way instead of on private property. This standard was intended to allow limited off-site short-term bike parking in the public right-of-way in certain circumstances where there might not be space on the property. It was really intended for existing buildings where a change of use or a small addition would require additional parking and there might not be any on site. However, some applicants have looked at this as an option, even when building a brand new building, that they have an opportunity to put the bike parking on the public right-of-way instead of on site. So we'd like to clarify that and perhaps revise that section to even remove the ability to locate bike parking off-site and amend the provisions to include only an in lieu fee as an alternative to providing the short-term bike parking. That's because there are a number of issues with potentially placing bike parking on the public right-of-way related to liability, maintenance, conflicts with existing structures on the public right-of-way. So an in lieu fee could be an option. Also to require bike parking on site to the maximum extent possible for existing buildings and changes of use, and that any required bike parking that can't be placed on site be satisfied with the payment of the fee, and to also clarify that new buildings are expected to provide all the required bike parking on site. 26 is to clarify the policy intent of bicycle parking in the context of reducing required parking. Now that standard was to provide a parking reduction strategy that allowed non-required bike parking spaces to replace required automobile parking. Again, applicants confuse this as a credit, which would allow an applicant to provide extra bike parking in order to reduce the minimum amount of parking that they were required to provide. So there was some confusion with that standard. And so the policy option is to clarify that this is a replacement strategy, and to revise the language to clarify that the bike parking would need to replace an existing parking space and not apply to new projects with proposed parking spaces. Number 27 is to create consistency between the methodology used for determining lapse of rights for alcohol-related uses with the methodology used for determining lapse of rights for non-conforming uses. That standard identifies a certain length of time when an alcohol outlet without a CUP is considered to have discontinued operations and is thereby required to attain a CUP. Typically, this is within 1 year of closure. If a new alcohol outlet has not come in, then a CUP would be required. However, for non-conforming uses, we allow that 1 year clock to pause if there is an active building permit. So if that space is undergoing some kind of construction or TI work, we allow that 1 year time period to pause, whereas we don't currently do that for alcohol uses. So the intent is to make those consistent so that a restaurant perhaps undergoing some kind of remodel or TI, if it has a building permit, we can pause that 1 year clock before they would need a CUP. So that is intended to make that language consistent. Number 28 applies to accessory dwelling units and revisiting a few outstanding issues that the commission had after their recent revisions to those standards. The first is to revisit the existing maximum allowable size for an accessory dwelling unit. That limitation serves to ensure that that these ADUs are accessory to the primary residence, to protect the character of the single unit residential district, and to maintain that standard from the prior zoning ordinance. Now, during the review of these standards, the commission had inquired about perhaps looking at increasing that maximum allowable size for ADUs. The current standard is 650 square feet. Staff provided some information regarding the existing and average sizes of single unit residences in various single unit neighborhoods throughout the city to give you kind of an idea what those average size residences are by neighborhood. And you can see that they range from a little over 1,000 in the Ocean Park districts to the North Montana, which is almost 3,500 square feet for an average size. So perhaps, you know, a hard and fast size limit is not appropriate. Maybe it's a percentage. You know, those are things to explore if the commission did intend to look at the size of ADUs. The second issue with ADUs regards the providing additional regulations related to the conversion of existing garages. While looking at those standards, the commission expressed some concern with the ability of a property owner to perhaps build a brand new garage and then come back soon afterwards and convert it to an ADU that did not conform to setback standards. So that is something else that the commission wanted to discuss. Some initial policy options for that are to establish perhaps a date prior to, for which a garage had to have been in existence prior to converting to an ADU. Another was establishing a minimum amount of time from when a new garage was constructed to when it could be converted. And also you could maintain the existing standards, which currently are silent in terms of that time frame to conversion of a garage to an ADU. The third was to explore the possibility of creating affordability levels for the rental of ADUs. Currently, we do not have any standards to regulate the affordability levels. So you can perhaps explore possible affordability levels for rentals of ADUs, maintain the existing standards, which currently don't provide for any of those regulations. Another potential option is to defer till we look at the affordable housing regulations in general. Almost done. Number 29 is to eliminate the requirement for administrative approval review for multi-unit residential development in the Ocean Park zoning districts. Currently, the zoning ordinance requires development in the Ocean Park districts to get administrative approval, which is a staff level review of code compliance for the multi-unit project. However, this review is not required for multi-unit projects in the R2, R3, or R4 districts. So the potential option is to eliminate the AA requirement for multi-unit developments in the Ocean Park districts to make it consistent with the other multi-unit districts in the city. It would remove that extra step, which is a little time consuming and would cost money for the applicant when that code review already happens at the ARB level as well. So that would make it consistent for all multi-unit residential districts. Or you could also maintain that process. Number 30 is to add the word allow to the section that deals with code enforcement procedures. The current language in that section says that no person shall establish, operate, erect, move, alter, enlarge, or maintain any use, activity, or improvement in contravention of any articles or provisions of the code. There was a recent case where a property owner attempted to deflect the responsibility of a tenant's violation and failed to compel the tenant to comply by arguing that they weren't aware of the particular regulation, and so they were trying to shirk their responsibility for the violation by putting it on the tenant. But by adding the word allow, it allows the code enforcement division to prevent that type of scenario. So it's basically just adding another verb to the list of things that code enforcement has purview over. Number 31 is to clarify language maintaining the city's authority to enforce development agreement provisions. Currently, this section of the code gives the city enforcement authority over the zoning ordinance. Even though we have authority over development agreements, it doesn't explicitly say that in the zoning ordinance. So this would add language and specific reference to development agreements so that there isn't any confusion there. 32 is to consider revising the definition of the restaurant limited service and takeout land use classification to eliminate language that references limited table service as a component of the use. This standard defines what types of establishments are considered limited service and takeout as opposed to full service restaurants. And it includes a variety of different types of limited service and takeout establishments: cafes, coffee shops, delis, fast food restaurants, sandwich shops, ice cream shops. But the reference to limited table service is a little confusing because a lot of these uses actually don't have limited table service. So it's limiting to that effect by including that phrase. An ice cream shop or a restaurant like Tender Greens or Lemonade, they do not have limited table service. However, we would consider this to be a restaurant of limited service. So by removing that phrase, it helps to kind of clarify the types of uses that could go or be considered this use without hopefully causing too much confusion. So the option would be to strike that phrase from the definition. And finally, number 33 is pretty straightforward. It is just to revise the definition of a medical marijuana dispensary in the zoning ordinance to be consistent with state law. So there's just a few terminology differences that would change, but it would be consistent with the state definition. So that concludes my presentation, and if you have any questions, we are happy to help.
Thanks, Tony. We have a couple of chits. Can you,
Oh,
can you wait?
yeah.
Yeah, okay. Thanks. So there's about 5 speaker slips. I'm going to call off 3 names, and if you could line up and prepare to speak. Hank Koenig, to be followed by Robert Poser and Owen Gubbins.
Hello. Good evening, Chair, Commissioners. I'll keep my comments brief. My firm has submitted a number of applications for planning approval since the 2015 zoning ordinance was adopted, and we have encountered a number of items that have presented, in my opinion, unnecessary challenges. These items could benefit from further review and revision. The most significant of these is the street wall height requirement, which on sloping lots cannot be complied with, and as such the only solution is actually obtaining a variance. And as this impacts many lots, Santa Monica is steeper than you think. As a bicyclist, I know that. Having to get a variance as the only way to code compliance is simply not right. I emailed you some case studies showing downslope, upslope and cross-slope situations, and I'm happy to answer questions you may have on that. I also emailed you a list of other items that, while it's possible to comply with these, I often get asked by my clients or people working in my office, what's the purpose of these regulations? What are they trying to solve? How come I can do it in other jurisdictions, not here? And I have to respond, I don't know. And then sometimes I ask staff, and they're equally stumped. So I gave a list of those. I'm not asking for them to be solved tonight, but I just ask that you recommend to staff that these be included in bucket 2. These are challenges that are an impediment to housing production, parking efficiency, sustainability, etc. So I'm going to leave it at that. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.
Commissioner McKinnon has a question for you, Hank.
So when the original zoning update process was going on, I noticed the planning department got some architects together who worked in the city and formed a group, and then there were some recommendations out of that. Would that be a useful thing for people who are working in the city to do that again?
Yeah, they did that for the DCP, and they called some folks together and reviewed some stuff, and I thought that was very helpful. I think staff did as well. So we're sort of in the trenches with planning staff, and I know it might take a little bit longer to do that now, but it'll save time in terms of application and review processes and stuff like that.
So how many buildings do you think the street wall thing applies to? I mean, how many parts of the city are we really looking at where there's a fall of 5 feet?
Well, basically the difficulty on a downslope lot is if the site slopes more than 5 feet. I used Casa Escobar as an example, not because
you've got something going on there.
I don't have anything going there, but I walk past it, and I'm walking past it, and I'm like, it's not that steep. It doesn't feel that steep. And then I measured it, and I said, well, yeah, this would be a situation where actually if you built your floor level at sidewalk level, which is what we want people to do, you're by definition, and I don't want to mention the word basement. Oh, I just did.
Right. Or
your
garage.
ground floor, which is the same as first floor, is actually below the sidewalk level. So then when I apply first story street wall height, I'm like, How do I do that? It doesn't make sense.
So-
and then on the side, you've got this situation where you're stepping it, and I gave you examples. 1626, it's in a dip in, it's affordable housing, it's in a dip in the street, and we had to get a modification, I think, for the street wall height in that situation.
So the parts of the city are certainly that far end of Wilshire, out where Casa Escobar is,
Oceanfront, Lincoln,
Pico. Well, not all of Main Street would fall 5 feet, but you know, on the frontage.
not. Oh, there is a bit on the hill. Yeah, you're right. That's right. You live there, don't you?
On Main Street.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So-
Ocean
It
Park Boulevard. and so on.
you know, it always surprises me. I take.
So in essence, a substantial number of the main boulevards around town,
Yeah,
where you're looking
yeah,
at some sort of
exactly.
building. Okay,
Exactly.
thank you.
Commissioner Lambert. Okay, good.
Thank you.
Thanks, Hank. Robert Poser.
Good evening. My name is Bob Posek, and I've lived in Santa Monica now on the corner of 18th Street and Carlisle for over 30 years with my wife and my 2 daughters. This is actually the second time that I've addressed the Planning Commission regarding R1 issues. Back in 1998 and 99, I was a member of NOMA, and at that time we requested that changes in the existing ordinance be made, and with your help and guidance, the Planning Commission, we were able to scale back the size of the new construction in our neighborhoods. I think now we're facing even a greater threat, not only in our neighborhood, but throughout Santa Monica, especially in the Sunset Park, excuse me, Sunset Park and the Northeast neighbors. According to the City of Santa Monica website, there are now nearly 40 demolition permits either pending in review or recently issued north of Montana alone, and there's an equal number in Sunset Park. And this compares to, back in 98, 25 demolition permits in 1997 before we started the whole thing with the ordinance, and 33 in the first half of 1998 as compared to over 40 now. This is when we petitioned the City Council to adopt an emergency interim ordinance until the final ordinance was drafted, and that took about a year, so it was a long process. I think the problem is actually more severe today than it was back in 98 and 99. If you just walk the streets, not only in our neighborhood, but like I said, in Sunset Park, the northeast part of Santa Monica, demolitions and new constructions are everywhere. And there's the older one-story, and now in our neighborhood, even 2-story older homes are being torn down and replaced with overbuilt 2-story structures that are out of scale with the existing homes. They block the sunlight in the neighborhood and the neighboring homes, diminish their privacy, and ultimately I think they decrease their value by having these large structures looming over their backyard. The stated purpose of the Santa Monica zoning ordinance is to, quote, and this is, protect the quality of residential life and activities, to provide stable and desirable residential neighborhoods, and to provide for citizen participation in development decisions-making process. And the stated purpose of the single-unit residential districts goes even farther, in that it says, quote, to preserve and protect the existing character and state of the city's potential deleterious impacts related to development, traffic, and noise, and also to ensure that the scale and design of new development and alterations to existing structures are consistent with the scale, mass, and character of the existing homes. This is just not being, these guidelines aren't being followed now. We've lost control of our neighborhoods to those who I think have no vested interest in where we live. They come in, they build the largest homes they can to maximize their profits, and they move on. And they leave us with these overbuilt homes that really makes our neighborhood look more like Santa Monica now. So we've lost our identity, I think, to a greater degree. So what I'm asking you is to consider changes to the existing ordinance carefully, and to take the decision-making process out of the hands of the few and back to those of us who live here.
Thank you. Commissioner Lambert has a question for you.
As you know, I feel your pain. I live in Sunset Park, and it's like a construction zone.
Yeah.
And it is, in my opinion, out of control. Has your group put together a list of what you'd like to see?
We have, and actually we gave it to you, emailed it to you anyway. We have a bucket list that we gave to you,
okay,
yes.
I just wanted to confirm that.
Quite extensive.
And I know you've met with staff. Do you have a sense of the timing? Or maybe staff could?
Not yet.
I heard fall of this year.
So now that the DCP is done, we are looking at several things that are on our list: the PICO plan, the Memorial Park plan, the R1 standards, and we are figuring out when we will be able to address those items. So we'll have more information on that within a few weeks.
Well, it just is one. I mean, I agree that we're really at a point of it's being very dire. And I know that a lot of the houses being built in my neighborhood, and I suspect in yours as well, are spec houses. And not that that really should matter one way or the other, but it really does, you know, in terms of what it's adding or detracting from the neighborhood. I think this is a very high priority, and I would like to see it treated as such. Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner McKinnon also has a question for you,
Well,
Mr. Posick.
it's raining in the developers, Commissioner Lambert. You've got to be very careful about that. I would make the point, Mr. Posick, that sometime last year, as a result of some representations from the North of Montana organisation, as a commission, we moved a motion that the City Council should have a look at the R1 standards. And as the Planning Director has indicated, that is now on their agenda. I think that happened at some point, a couple of months ago, maybe there was some consideration of it. And so that issue is being addressed, but clearly not as fast as the people are snapping up properties and demolishing them and moving forward.
Right.
So I'm not sure exactly how we can assuage your feelings. But
What we did in '98 is we did petition the City Council directly to enact an interim emergency ordinance. And what that did, it did not stop development, but it just imposed a sort of a minor modification on the existing ordinance, scale it back a little bit. And then it took a year with your help to finally adapt the final ordinance, which is what we have pretty much more or less right now with the 35% and 26%.
I heard that. I think what I'm saying to you is that we're a little ahead of the game. We've made that motion to start with. You may have to do the rest of that as well. But thank you for drawing it to our attention again tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Posick. Owen Gubbins, to be followed by Paula Larimore and Ken Kutcher.
We're all together tonight. Good evening, Commissioners. Owen Gubbins with Harding, Larimore, Kutcher and Kozel. I'm asking tonight that you support staff's suggested fix, making the abandonment period for alcohol-related uses consistent with that which applies to all other non-conforming uses. This would allow for the pausing of the abandonment clock while a building permit is active. And I'm asking that for the following reasons. Following three reasons, actually. First, I think it's unreasonable for the abandonment clock to tick while a building permit for remodeling is active. Remodeling, even if it's purely cosmetic, is often required for new businesses seeking to commence operations in what has been a long-standing alcohol establishment, e.g. a restaurant. While a building permit is active, the new operator is obviously taking the steps needed to resume operations and is proceeding in good faith to do so. More than anyone, the new operator wants to open his or her business as soon as possible. And because of this, it makes sense to pause the abandonment clock and not allow any alcohol rights to expire while building permits remain active. Second, construction, as we all know, can take longer than anticipated. Many construction projects take longer for a variety of reasons. In some cases, there'll be contractors who walk off the job. Others, there may be long lead times for materials. And the owner shouldn't be punished for wanting to do a really good job and making sure that the project is done correctly. The abandonment period could also expire because of delays due to third-party actions. They may not be able to get the required inspections in time. They may not be able to get the required county health department sign-off. And so I'd hate to see these businesses that are doing everything they can to open up on time, maintain their rights, and suddenly lose them because of something a third party has done, or if they decided to change the color of their walls and that somehow delayed the process. So I'd ask you to support that change. Thanks very much.
Commissioner McKinnon has a question.
Not on this, but Mr. Gubbins, you're an expert at land use law and some experience
If you say so.
in accessory dwellings. Any thoughts on one of the other issues that we've got here, which is number 28, which is the size of accessory dwelling units?
Yeah, well, it's funny you bring that up because I was looking at those this weekend, and I think they're pretty.
With your mother-in-law, I understand. Is that right?
She did mention it to me. Yes.
I just want to help you out here.
So apparently you can only put 250 square feet on the second story, which, you know, for people who already have a garage and they're happy with the accommodations for cars or storage or whatever they use their garages for, and they want to go up a little bit, that 250 feet is obviously a very small amount of space for anything approaching a dwelling unit.
So the reason I ask is it actually follows from the last speaker that clearly some people might find it easier to demolish the whole dwellings on an R1 lot rather than just put on 250 feet, because they can build multiple thousands of square feet if they have a new dwelling, right?
Sure.
So do you think that would stop that?
Potentially. Yeah, I mean, it gives people options at least, and some people like their old homes and they don't want to tear them down. They could, you know, put together an accessory dwelling unit to accommodate out-of-town guests, because a lot of people don't have extra bedrooms, or, you know, accommodate children who, for whatever reason, want to live at home.
Or move into it themselves and let their family move into the main house.
That's another idea.
Yeah. Right, thank you.
Thanks.
A series of inside jokes there. Okay, Paula Larmore.
Good evening, Commission. Paula Larmer with Harding, Larmer, Kutcher, and Kozel. I have 3 issues I want to speak tonight, and they all relate to housing projects we've been working on in the city. The first issue is the street wall height issue that Hank Koenig spoke to earlier. This affects 3 out of the 4 housing projects that our firm has worked on since the zoning ordinance was adopted. And the problem's twofold. The first issue with the street wall height is that it's measured from all points along the sidewalk rather than some type of average. So if you have a sloping property and you're trying to have a level floor, it's difficult to comply with because the street wall height measurement standard is also sloped. So one fix would be to increase the height of your floor so that you can comply with the minimum, but then you violate the 20-foot maximum. So that's the first issue, is that it's measured from all points along the sidewalk. The second is that it only applies, or that it specifically applies to the first story. And as I think you've all seen, we have issues where the first story is completely below grade along some commercial boulevards. And so there is no way, it's not that it's difficult, it's impossible to comply with this standard. For commercial boulevards, you already have a minimum floor-to-floor height. It's 15 feet. So I don't understand the need for this particular requirement, the 15-foot minimum. I do understand why you want the 20-foot maximum, but I'm not sure you need the 15-foot minimum for the street wall height, because where you require commercial, you already have 15-foot floor-to-floor. And where you don't require commercial, maybe 15 feet isn't the right standard there. There's 2 other issues that are potentially affecting housing projects, and that's the affordable percentage. And I ask you to please defer any discussion of changing the current standard, which allows applicants to choose affordability levels, until you have a broader discussion of how to incentivize housing in the other commercial areas of the city. 90% of your housing projects last year were approved in the downtown. The DCP was just adopted, and it will require 20 to 30% with no applicant option to do less in return for lower levels of affordability. So I don't see this as an urgent issue. You're not getting a lot of housing in other commercial areas of the city. So again, please keep the current standard. Don't impose another impediment, burden, and element of risk on applicants trying to do housing on the boulevards. The last one is the rounding issue. Currently for Tier 2 and Tier 3 projects, any fractional unit that results from application of the 20 to 30% in the downtown is rounded up. 0.2 is rounded up to a whole unit. So if I want to do an 11 unit project, that's 2.2, it's 3 units, that's 27% rather than 20, which the code says it's supposed to be requiring.
Commissioner McKinnon.
So it used to be that instead of rounding, you'd have to pay some sort of fee.
Up to 0.75.
Is that what you're advocating?
Yes, just go use that standard for also Tier 2 and Tier 3. And you could limit that to projects that elect the 15% or are required to do 15% or more, and not apply it to the people that choose the 7.5.
or projects that are only of a certain size.
Sure.
So that if you have something that's 50, you might.
Right. It definitely impacts smaller projects greater.
And what would the thinking be, that it's under 20 or under 30 that you'd bring this in?
I haven't done the math. I was more thinking you'd more do it based on the required percentage of affordable, 15% and greater, rather than unit.
Right. Okay.
Unit number.
Thank you.
Commissioner Lambert.
Well, you're actually proposing this for tier 2, right? I mean, tier 1 does not have that rounding up.
Correct. Oh, it's only tier 2, and then the certain tier 3 projects that are going under the zoning ordinance / DCP that have this.
So what you're proposing, I think, is just making that universal across all the tiers.
Correct. That's one option. And a different option would be if you choose the 7.5%, you still have to round any fractional. But if you do the 15% or higher, you get to go back to the 0.75.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Ken Kutcher to be followed by Danilo Bach.
Thank you. Good evening, Commissioners. Ken Kutcher, 1256th Street. I'm here to talk about bucket number 20. That's dealing with historic preservation, subject near and dear to my heart. And it's the provision that deals with non-conforming uses in landmark structure, and whether or not that use needs to be a predominant use if it's been discontinued more than a year and can't be resumed absent a CUP. Inadvertently, I'm the source of why staff is bringing this to you, and I'm objecting to the language. I'm not here on behalf of anybody, but at the time I was discussing with staff 3355 Barnard Way, which I know at least 2 of you are familiar with. That's a property that was originally a telephone switching station and subsequently a cultural art use, mostly really art storage. When it was a switching station, it also had commercial office on the top floor, and and it's a 4-story building, and on a second floor there were also predominantly telephone offices, and there were switching offices. Was office use a predominant use? I don't know. It was a meaningful use there. It was a use that was there a long time. And I would remind you that the CUP process itself is highly discretionary. It requires a number of conditions, including that it's compatible, that the property is physically suitable. You have enough area and room already to decide whether to grant a CUP or not. The idea that you would prevent an applicant from even seeking that CUP because it wasn't the predominant use, but it was a use of that property, to me doesn't make a lot of sense, and I don't think it's needed. I think that if there was a legitimate use there, you might say it was a meaningful or substantial use. It doesn't need to be the predominant use, or maybe it was there for at least some number of years. But to me, all you're doing is you're providing an option for an owner of a landmark property to come to you for a discretionary application. And I think you want to make that as wide as possible for owners of landmark properties. We know those are always difficult and tricky, and this would be a nice opportunity to be able to apply for and see if you could, one could seek permission for use like that. I'm not currently working on 3355 Barnard Way, so I'm not talking about that specifically, but I think that was a prime example of how this could come up. Happy to answer any questions.
Can I have a question?
Sure.
It's a little unclear to me. So I guess first a clarification. Is the idea that a use, I guess in your example, like a use like the office could be allowed, but through a CUP?
Yes, and that's already in the code. The question is, does it have to be the predominant use? This code section came up primarily because of 2125 Arizona, which had been for many years and was built for this purpose, a medical office use. It's in an R2 zone. That office use was discontinued for more than a year, and in a residential zone. It could not be reintroduced. It was a landmark structure, and the structure wasn't going.
Sorry, I get all that. Right. So I guess my question to you is that I see a CUP as a permit process that basically says this is an okay use, we're comfortable with this use, but it has certain impacts, so we're going to condition it. And I guess, like, what if you actually didn't want that use, right? Like, that's why
Sure.
it's not an allowed use. So I guess I'm just...
I mean, I defer to your staff's interpretation, but a CUP is not something that you need to approve. You're allowed to approve a conditional use permit, but there's no mandate, and the findings are quite general. And for these applications in particular, the findings include that the physical location and placement of the use on the site is compatible. So you might find, for example, staff points out, maybe we don't want office on the ground floor in some area. You'd say no office there. That the proposed use would not be detrimental to the public interest. That it's consistent with other uses that are allowed in the zone. I mean, there's
room, is what you're saying.
I think there's plenty of room in there to either deny it or, in some cases, maybe condition it. For example, on the first floor, maybe you don't allow that use. But to say that if it wasn't a predominant use, you can't even apply for it, to me, that's unnecessarily burdensome, and that this is supposed to get at flexibility for these kinds of structures.
Right. Commissioner Lambert has a question.
I don't remember. I know we were both involved in the Mar Vista back in the days. Was that built as an office building?
No, that was built as hotel apartment building. Kind of, it was one of those.
But it's being turned into offices, correct?
Yes, and that's because it's allowed use in that.
It's an allowed use, so it's not a non-conforming use. Oh, okay, I got you. Okay.
And this language also says that if it was in residential use as of a certain date, that you can't take advantage of whatever the prior uses were. So that was addressed. The residential concern was addressed previously.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Ken. Danilo Bach.
Good evening, Commissioners. First of all, I have to ask if someone left this here. I don't know if this is part of my time, but there's something here. All right, is that yours?
Tony, yeah.
All right. I'm representing the Land Use Committee of NOMA tonight. We have sent you a list of those things which we think should be taken under consideration with regard to modifications or further work on R1 because of what has been mentioned earlier, which is the danger or the threat active to the R1 neighborhoods, ours certainly, and we're finding out others in the city. Sunset Park, and we're also in touch with Northeast Neighbors and Mid-Cities and Friends of Sunset Park. To find out if we have common concerns, and the answer seems to be definitely. And I think that part of this has to do with the nature of real estate and the world in general, in terms of structures being torn down, housing, residential being torn down and built up, not necessarily for people who are building their own home, but because of the cost and the opportunity here, especially in the R1 sections, to make a certain profit, we have had a rather steady influx of developers who are supplying basically new mansions, in some cases McMansions, in most of the cases, but also are sort of encouraging a use of these houses as second houses, or people who are not really, don't seem to be, their intention doesn't seem to be to peg it toward people who are interested in the community. And what happens if you go through NOMO, for instance, you will see a certain sort of creation of enclaves where a large property is now walled in. And this has been enabled because it's possible to take advantage of our zoning on that to create things to shift the orientation of a house, where before it might have been on a narrower part, might have been on a side street. Now that has shifted so that they can create an enormous 8-foot wall that runs at least half a block. in any event, there are many, many instances of these, unfortunately. So we have sort of drawn up a list of those concerns of ours. We weren't expecting that there would be already a list, but we have tried to respond to some of the items in tonight, and thank you. I also want to thank the Planning Commission director or the planner for his interest and assistance in this. But I'm not finished, but if anyone has a question, I'll wrap it up.
Commissioner Lambert.
I'm not sure what else you were going to say, but I have two questions.
Yeah.
One is, have you thought or has your group discussed, and this could result in the sky falling on us, what about a threshold for single-family design review by the ARB?
Well, we have spoken about it. We have been told that this is like a third rail in much of zoning. We would like that because, unfortunately, there's also a cookie cutter aspect to some of these new houses that are being built. They're literally sort of, to mix metaphors, they're cookie cutter mushrooms. They sort of sprout up instantly and maximizing what they can. We would like to consider that. Basically, we have sort of assembled over the last several months, and we've just in the process of this now. As I said at the beginning, I'm representing the Land Use Committee, not everyone, because we haven't sort of had a full-ranging discussion in NOMA about this. And we also are hoping to get input and consideration from other neighborhood associations and neighborhoods R1 to find out what they feel about this and how intensely they feel that this should be addressed. And my sense is, more than my sense, but what I've been told already, is that there's a great concern with what's going on, not just obviously in NOMA, but in other neighborhoods.
The other thought I had, and this may be insurmountable actually, is looking at neighborhood conservation overlay districts for specific areas of NOMA and Sunset Park and wherever it's happening, that would actually prescribe design guidelines for those areas, so that there would be some contextual design standards, so that, I mean, my neighborhood's all being developed by an Orange County developer, and it looks like the suburbs of Orange County.
Yes, right. It's
horrible.
That's happening in our neighborhood as well.
Not to discount love Orange County.
There is that particular, now I'm blanking on it, in NOMA, that area which has been invaded.
You told me it's like 9th to...
and it's a particular, someone help me out here, what the, it's called. But that, it would be very helpful. That's one of the things we want to consider, the possibility of doing with an overlay district, because it would be very helpful in retaining and creating a sense of community and neighborhood. And these are not small houses as they exist. They're substantial houses, and we don't think it's any sort of restriction which cannot be dealt with and would not be welcome.
Well, I said that probably your first priority would be to lower the height limit.
Well, absolutely. In fact, if you look, I think that's number one on the list. And what we would like to do as well is we would like to have during these next weeks and months, we would very much like to palaver, as we say, with the staff to get their sense of where they think these things can be addressed and how we might go about it. This is not sort of a us against them situation. It's a case of basically saving the neighborhoods of Santa Monica and the R1.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, those are all the public input. Tony, you're looking awfully relaxed. Now is your moment.
I do have a general question.
Okay, Commissioner Fresco.
When I sat down with my report, I went through my pile of previous discussions and I found the list of a lot of these similar items to see what we had said about them and what I had noted about them back a year ago. It was August 3rd, 2016, and I noticed this list is not really the same list as that was, and I did not take the time to figure out what was missing and what was added, but what happened? Can you just explain it? Where did they all go?
Yeah, the list has fluctuated over time. Some of it has been reorganized. Some of the items we've taken care of. Some were identified as maybe not being needed. So it's been a fluid list. We've added more items over time as well.
What does that mean? You took care of them or decided they weren't
like, for
needed?
example-
Weren't they things we put on there so we could decide that?
No. No, the list has come from a whole variety of sources. It wasn't compiled by the Planning Commission.
Some of them were maybe upon looking at it again, it was something that maybe we figured out actually didn't need a change in the code.
I see.
So that list has evolved over time in many different ways. So it will look different than what we saw a year ago.
I think we can assure you, though, that anything that the commission has put on there has not been taken off
Right.
without your knowledge. These have really been very minor staff ambiguities that, after second and third review, we've just determined that, they're not.
It's fine.
Yeah, they're not confusing after all. So, yeah.
Well, they were confusing, but all right. Thank you.
Great. Any other big picture questions?
Nothing big.
So,
I have a procedural question.
yeah, Commissioner Levy.
Since there are only 4 of us tonight, what happens if we don't get 4 votes on everything?
We're not voting tonight,
We're
right?
not,
Yeah.
So no straw votes, no
You're
nothing.
not voting. You're
Oh,
just
okay,
discussing.
cool. All right.
Yeah.
So that was something I just wanted to clarify, that we're not voting tonight. We're, I think, exploring pros and cons of various policy options so that staff gets a sense and can then go do some more research and come back with more specific recommendations.
That's correct.
Great.
I have two
McKeon.
questions that came up out of former Chair Koenig's comments. One, he sent us this list that seems to have 3 items about parking, 4 items about parking, a couple about screens on roof, R&R room sizes, loading screenings. Can they be added to the bucket too? Because it's clear that that's something that's arisen out of the application of the zoning code. And the second thing was I asked him a question about this small group that you put together of architects during the DCP, which seemed to highlight practical issues. Can that also be redone again for some input?
So to the first question, yes, we can certainly add more items that we can regard as being bucket 2 items that fall in that category.
Well, a lot of them do seem to be relatively small items that
Sure.
would make a big difference to the building of
Sure.
buildings.
Yeah, we're absolutely open to suggestions and additions to that list. So we can certainly do that. We can take a closer look at that. We got that pretty late, but we can definitely look at that. In terms of perhaps creating working groups and incorporating the expertise and opinions of architects, we can certainly do that as well in exploring options to help fix some of these standards.
Well, I'm figuring that they must have at least tried to comply, and some of them will go, that's not possible, or there's an easier way of doing it.
Absolutely.
It'd be useful to have that feedback.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, they're the ones who are using these standards, so and they're the ones that over the past year and a half have identified some of these issues.
Cool, thank you.
All right, so I think we're ready to jump into number 16 regarding the minimum 15-foot first-story street wall height. Anyone?
So I guess one of the thoughts that I had was that perhaps the way around that is to, instead of going to the major and minor modification thing, is to make the planning director on appeal to either the Planning Commission or the ARB a person that can modify that. So if there's a practical issue about ground floor or the heights along the wall, that as it's going through the planning director or his delegate could be the person that approves some sort of minor change without this coming back to us.
On the wall.
Yeah, on the height of the wall. I mean, what they're really saying is that in some places it falls 5 feet or 7 feet or 8 feet. At the moment they're constrained, they have to do this and they have to do that. Why not write in it that they could apply to the planning director to have it altered, and then if it's a problem either for them or for the community, they can come on appeal to either us or the ARB. But in essence, that's building a building that's going to get an approval anyway. This is about how you put it together, and I don't know.
It makes sense. I don't see how you can codify. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I don't see how you can codify so many different kinds of slope conditions. So I would support that kind of approach.
Maybe we could consider uncodifying, I guess would be one way to do it. Tony, can you clarify the minor and major modification? Is there a process in place now for?
Yes, I believe currently the process is only a major modification to address this minimum street wall height. And so that is a application that goes to the zoning administrator under discretionary review process.
But there's a limit to the change,
Yes,
right? Only
I
up
believe
to
it can go down to 12 feet through that major modification process. So it's a 3-foot lowering of that standard.
And sorry, I'm going to ask one more question. It was just
You're the chair.
do we have a standard like this in the DCP?
We do. So one of the things we could also look at is reducing the standard, because in the DCP we reduced the minimum to 11 feet and a maximum of 16. And I think this was actually brought up by Commissioner Fonder Bernardi originally.
That's floor to floor, though.
Yeah. We don't have a first story street wall height in the DCP. It's basically just ground floor height. And that was lowered, from 15 or, whatever it is, citywide, which is 15 to this lower standard, given the variety of conditions that we may encounter at the ground floor, whether it's residential use or commercial use. So in a citywide application, I think what we have experienced in implementing these with some projects is noticing that the 15-foot at the ground floor is probably excessive, for the kinds of ground floor uses that are occurring in these mixed use projects. So, that's, certainly another way to go about it. And then adding potentially a modification in there, very similar.
You could do both.
Yeah,
in some
exactly.
places it's appropriate to have less than 15. We've learnt that through practice.
Right.
But it may also be that there is this fall that's higher than 5 feet, could be 8 feet, where without going through a lot of rigmarole, you actually can change it at a planning director level.
Right.
And if there's an issue, then it can be appealed either by the community or by someone else.
And I think this is one that we would probably try and workshop through with a working group to understand, because obviously downtown is a different topography than other parts of the east-west boulevards in the city, where there is, legitimately some significant slopes that happen across the property, and we'd want to understand what that means, where it's we've got quite a slope, and how that standard affects the design on the ground floor.
Wait, Commissioner McKinnon, hold on. Commissioner Lambert.
I just have a question. I totally support what you're saying, but if it's appealable, how is it different from a major modification?
Well, I'm really thinking in the majority of cases there's not going to be an appeal. But if it really retains the right for it to come to either us or the ARB if someone feels badly done by it, if they're the architect running it or the community. So...
Why not make it the same process as the minor modification, where it goes to the hearing officer, right?
That's what we're looking at.
You wouldn't. It's not a. I mean, you call it a minor modification. You can call it whatever you want, but then it would just go to a hearing officer for an appeal.
I'm okay with
faster.
that. I'm also okay with the discussion about the changing the height.
Right.
I can remember our discussion was to make this walkable streets. And clearly in some places the 15 feet's proving to be a little bit tricky. Not in all cases, but in some cases. So how do we do that?
Right.
Yeah. Commissioner Fresco, you have...
I have a similar reservation about the 11 feet as I had other places, in that my understanding, which is a little weak on these particular areas, is that some uses might not be possible when the height gets too low, and we're losing flexibility in buildings long term. And a retail shop, a little dress shop, can go in anything. A restaurant needs a lot more, and however a certain space is used is really dictated by what's available, and that limitation gives me a concern. So I am more comfortable with the idea of making it a minor mod to get a more significant adjustment than that way it's reviewed and we're making sure we're not closing options.
Because I would clarify that my understanding is that there's a couple of things that are different in the DCP. One is that there is no street wall height requirement at all in the DCP, and that what there is a ground floor to floor height, right? So that's one difference too.
Right. I was uncomfortable with the 11 feet then too, I believe.
But are you okay with just talking about the floor to floor height as opposed to the street wall height?
Yes, yes.
The staff has some input.
I just want to confirm that a minor mod is director review and then appealable to the zoning administrator. So that wouldn't get to the planning commission.
That's me.
So I would like that appeal from David to Jing. You know, let's see how that works out. Have you ever turned down an appeal? Yeah. Yeah. I think what I was putting out was I was happy to look at the process by which they moved it forward, and also happy to look at the height discussion, given that there are different parts of the city that have different requirements. The other end of Pico is different to, say, Main Street. Okay. So we're 2 years further down the track. What could work? And that discussion would then take place next time round.
Okay.
Is that good with you, Tony? It's got enough direction? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Oh, I mean, Commissioner McKinnon.
You know, we never really give it up.
No, it's true. Some of us, anyway. Okay, number 17. Is about reconsidering the limit on skylights at a maximum of 12 inches above the roof. Commissioner Lambert.
I believe that 5 feet has been offered as an alternative. Did I read that correctly?
Yeah.
And I have no problem with that. I think a lot of it has to do with where it is on the roof. I mean, I think the setback from the front of the building is important. But I mean, I was persuaded by the pictures that Hank sent. That I don't, as always. I mean, I can understand there's some creativity, and 5 feet really is not that tall, particularly from the sidewalk out in front of the building. So that's what I would support.
Commissioner Fresco.
I'm not that comfortable with adding 5 feet to our building heights in neighborhoods. This is not downtown, so I'm much less comfortable with that. Although I did also note that because it says that projections above the height can't be more than 30% of the roof, but it doesn't say where, and definitely setback would make some increase much more palatable. But I think 5 feet sounds like a lot, and there's lots of other design adjustments that can be made to accommodate interesting skylights besides just adding more stuff to the height.
Commissioner McKinnon, do you have feedback?
Well, I think 12 inches is restrictive.
But 5 feet is a lot.
It does seem a reasonable amount. So, but I think if we're looking at energy efficiency and the way we're going in developments, we need to go above 12 inches. It could be 30 inches. I'm not sure what the right level is, but I'm open to the change. So that may be something, Tony, that you need to come back with some further thoughts on.
Tony, did you jump to the 5 feet because that's a standard that we're using for other things?
Actually, staff did not propose the 5 feet. That came from the public.
Okay.
But,
Well, really one member of the public, I suspect.
But if it's the commission's direction that we should look at raising that limit, and we can look at what might be appropriate.
I'm comfortable with that direction too.
And maybe considering a setback of some kind to
Absolutely.
offset the appearance of the height. So I don't want to let buildings be 5 feet higher.
I'm sure we would want to look at setbacks and how much of the area.
Although in some buildings, if it's well set back, 5 feet wouldn't make that much difference in the middle of a building, but it would on a single family.
Well, he'll come up with a great formula for us, I'm sure.
There's a lot of pressure on you now, Tony, already, and only 2 bucket items in.
Just to clarify that we work as a team, and it's not one person's recommendation.
Yeah, but
Okay.
you're standing up front. And this is largely single-family homes that this is applying to, or are there offices as well, or?
The skylight limit, I believe,
It
applies to
everywhere.
all districts.
Yeah, all districts.
But I think, yeah, so it applies to all buildings.
Okay.
Yeah, we would probably also want to look at, because we've run into this issue with solar energy systems as well. You know, it's permissive, but fortunately seen some installations where they've gone well beyond maybe what's needed in order to create like a trellis or something up there. And I think this is a similar thing that, we just want to look carefully at where we're allowing something special because it's for this energy efficiency reason that it's actually needed for that purpose. And it's not something that kind of goes beyond what the intent was.
No, and there was a building at ARB the other night where that was passively solar, but the whole thing was designed to pull air through the building,
right,
and cool it naturally, which you can do in Santa Monica. And so you want to encourage that. And anything that stops that, and 12 inches is clearly stopping it,
Right.
we have to move on.
Right.
And yet the ugliness issue is something that's obviously in people's mind.
Okay. Enough clarity there?
Sure. Thank you.
Okay. All right. 18 has to do with the affordability levels for Tier 2 projects. Commissioner Lambert, would you like to start with this one?
After being through the affordability discussion of the DCP, I would propose that we look at this in a much broader context, that we not take this piece by piece, because that just doesn't make sense to me. And I know the Housing Commission is involved in this too, and we discovered with the DCP that they clearly have the ears of the council, and I don't want us to do something that is maybe contrary, but at least it's been in discussion with the Housing Commission. So I think that we should put this over again for a more broad discussion of affordability in general.
Commissioner Fresco? Okay.
And I think that's a good idea because also...
Note that she nodded.
So I think I raised at the last meeting that either as a 13 item or as part of this discussion that I would raise the idea that we would look at administrative approval for zero emission buildings. And so that's an attempt to get more housing on the boulevards and in Bergamont. And the issue of affordability goes into that. So we had some buckets when we were talking about the DCP, which was providing certainty and removing uncertainty for people who are going to build, which is the AA process, looking at the level of affordability and also the level of fees. And basically on the boulevards, we're looking at Tier 2 buildings, which are 40 feet high.
So far.
Yeah, and so the issue will be, how do we produce more of those buildings and less of this move towards commercial buildings that people are looking at? And one way might be a zero emission building. It also is an issue of the level of affordability. And so, long-winded way of saying, yeah, I think we need a wider look at affordability. And I'm also concerned that all these guys are just going to 7.5 because that allows them to jack up the prices on the rest of the market rates. So you're not getting a breakdown of affordability levels through the city, and particularly out on some of those boulevards. We do want that. The price of land is cheaper. We want more housing at every level. So the only question in my mind is, when is this likely to occur? When is the broader discussion about affordability levels?
May I say something?
Yeah.
I know I have heard from several council people that they plan on revisiting the boulevard zoning. So if that were to happen,
They consider doing what?
The boulevard zoning and its impact on housing. So that would be an affordability context at that point.
The things that I'm talking about are the same kind of things. How do you incentivize housing out there on the boulevards in Bergamont? If we go to zero emission or 100% environmentally responsible, maybe you go to an AA which cuts it out and so on. So there's that bracket. But the other bracket is, what's the right way to tackle affordability levels? And of course, there are the issues that more building will go on in the downtown than there will be on the boulevard. So we're producing a greater range of affordability at every level. How will that play out? So I think there's two separate sorts of things that are on at the same time under the same umbrella. But I don't want to leave it too much longer.
No. I just want to comment too on this. The 7.5% was a topic of discussion at the council, a long discussion. And for one thing, we have overproduced extremely low-income housing and that's what the 7.5% is. And yes, it's fewer units, but it's also far less revenues. So it's not as, I mean, if you do 20% low income, probably it's less revenue than 7.5% extremely low. But it's much less money for the developer if you do 7.5%.
Yeah, but you have a lot less of your project taken up, so that you've got more
No, I understand.
units.
But clearly at Pencils, or they wouldn't be doing it. So
Well, I think at Pencil's easier than some of the other levels, but nonetheless, I think we're on the same page, which is
Pencil, they won't build it.
yeah.
So can I clarify the review and discussion of the AHPP? Would that come to the Planning Commission, or would that be something?
I imagine that we would, yes, absolutely. This commission, the Housing Commission, and with council as well, obviously.
And SMER.
In terms of right, and I mean other non-city boards and commissions. We'd obviously talk with housing providers, housing developers, those involved in the development community. Kind of this comprehensive discussion around housing tools. We also are working on that direction from council on the impacts of Ellis. It was kind of the Ellis data study. So that is also coming forward. So there's several efforts underway in terms of looking at a comprehensive review of housing, and as part of the DCP, there's sort of the 6-month review, and also that discussion about kind of looking at the AHPP itself, which is a program that I think it's highlighted to us that kind of we need a bit of a second look at how that is implemented.
I would just add that this is something we need to obviously talk to Housing and Economic Development in the city manager's office. Where does this slot in with the other things that we are bringing forward? So,
And that was my next question, which is when is the earliest you could schedule something like this?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, are we 3 months or 6 months away?
Yeah, as I said before, we are looking at the pending items, talking about those with the city manager, and figuring out what that schedule is. So I'd be hesitant to make any promises before we do that, but we are doing that within the next few weeks, and expect to be able to come back to the commission with a kind of a fleshed out schedule.
Yeah, and
Let me just add, there are not going to be any more 7.5% projects in downtown.
No.
So you don't have to worry about that. Question is, are there going to be projects?
Commissioner McKinnon.
So when I originally raised the question about, zero emission, or what could you do to inspire projects to occur out on the boulevards and get them moving, which was in return for an AA, you'd have to do something for us, that it was all playing into the same discussion. So if we are moving forward with a discussion about housing and levels of affordability, I'm perfectly happy if that's going to occur together. It's really, we've got maybe 4 projects out there on the boulevards that are happening at the moment. That's not really enough. That wasn't what our anticipation was. So now we've done the DCP. How do we move forward with acceptable projects that combine places where people can afford to live in our city? Right, that's the primary requirement. So,
Could I just mention now, like, if we could think about doing a joint meeting of the Planning Commission and the Housing Commission, or a workshop or something like that, so maybe that the recommendations could be coordinated. I think that might be helpful to to the community and to the council. Okay, we good on that one? Okay. So item 19, is there any comment about this one? Commissioner Fresco.
Do we need to know what those changes are, or do we just wait until we get the red line?
Probably you'll see it with the red line, but
Okay.
they're pretty minor.
Okay.
So you can just tell us to do it.
Okay, I'm going to jump to 20 about the non-conforming use in a city designated historic resource. Commissioner McKinnon, I know you're...
I think that end of the table is...
Yeah, don't you dare.
Okay, Commissioner Fresco.
I just want to say that the purpose, Ken might have brought it onto this list, but I'm the one who brought it to you guys in the zoning ordinance update. And the purpose of this was not only as an incentive to allow additional uses to landmarks, but really to allow flexibility in uses so that there would be less intervention in gutting landmarks in order to reprogram them and that sort of thing. And that was really what we were aiming at, buildings that, you know, like it didn't quite work out the way I planned in the 2125 Arizona project, because that building was gutted, even though it's going to continue in its medical use. And that was not actually what was planned. So I think while office is obviously not as nice a use as arts use, and I can see why that would be a sad change, we can't tell people what use they have to do. All we can do is tell them what uses they can't do. But an office use would not be an invasive change for that building, and it's had a commercial use in that area forever. And I think it's really in the spirit of what this was created for. So if there's any extra layer that I would like to see just from preservation, and I even hesitate to add it, is the idea that it would minimize the changes to the historic structure. The advantage of the different use would be to minimize the changes to the historic structure during its conversion to that use. So that was really the idea. So basically I would say no change, or maybe add that, but I don't want to mess with it.
Any other feedback? Can I ask staff? I mean, the concern, was the concern just a lack of clarity, right? Was this really our intention?
So. I mean,
or was there
right? It
some
wasn't.
further concern?
I mean, we don't have like a real world example where this has been a problem. It was just the example that Ken brought up actually was where it triggered the, well, wait a minute, you know, is this potentially open to abuse? You know, to some unforeseen thing that we just don't know about yet. Someone happens to do research on a designated resource and says, you know, it was maybe constructed as it was supposed to be this, you know, high floor open space market, but there was, you know, an office in the back, you know, there was a room, someone had an office in there, and therefore
security office,
right, you know, there was a use in there, and the way that it's written, it's very broad, and our concern was just the, you know, the way it's written is it would allow that kind of a situation to proceed. And, you know, while there is a CUP process in place, you know, the CUP is really, it is a conditionally permitted use at the end of the day. I think you've heard us say, you know, that if you don't mean for something to be there, that we should just say it's prohibited, you know, as opposed to going through a CUP process where the findings may not, you know, lead you to that conclusion that it's not appropriate. You know, so I think we were raising it as an issue as we read the language, that it is very broad, and it's helpful, you know, to have heard the kind of background and intent as to what's meant by that. And I think, you know, that if it is to add this minimizing change, you know, is that an additional finding, you know, to the CUP, you can certainly always do that.
Something that refers to the idea that that the proposed use takes advantage of the way the building was originally constructed.
Orientation and the space and
this, right. Okay. So what you were saying, it's a big, you know, it's a movie theater and there was an office in the back so they can convert it to offices. The idea is really to allow a movie theater to exist in a zone that wouldn't necessarily allow a movie theater anymore.
Right.
But because it was built as a movie theater, that's obviously the best use for that building.
Right.
I guess maybe I'm misunderstanding though, but like, how does that impact an adaptive reuse, right? Like, I think sometimes you need to make modifications in order to accommodate the use. And
you can. I mean, if a movie theater is, you know, on Wilshire and offices in allowed use, they can convert it to offices and we can't stop them. But if a movie theater was no longer allowed on Wilshire, then and it was a movie theater building and they wished for it to be a movie theater, that would be a huge incentive for them to keep that building and to keep it in a lively use that was much more consistent with its historic shape and form and volume.
Yeah, I think
It's
I'm
an
asking.
incentive.
I think I'm asking. I guess it's an incentive until the condition that you're proposing is prohibitive in terms of adapting the building to that use, right? So then you've
Well,
kind of created a hurdle to, using the historic building.
Well, what we've done, what it does is it kind of limits which non-conforming uses we're going to allow in places, because that would only apply if they were trying to put a non-conforming use into the historic structure.
But doesn't the CUP process itself give us that?
Well, that was what we decided the first time around, but Jing was bringing up, and obviously the reason this is here is people were concerned that it might be opening the door to more inappropriate uses or non-conforming uses in neighborhoods. I mean, I don't really know where that would be. I mean, I'm pretty familiar. We couldn't really think of a lot of buildings where this would even apply to.
Yeah.
So,
Commissioner Lambert, sorry.
I'm confused. By non-conforming, you mean, for example, if the Wilshire Theater on Wilshire wanted to do something that was not in compliance with the zoning code?
right.
Well, that's clear. I mean, but clearly returning it to a movie theater is probably not the most feasible idea in the world. I mean, it's retail now.
Well, I was just using examples for a building that was built for a special
gotcha.
purpose.
Okay.
So basically, if it's built for a special purpose and they want to do it, it'll be easy for them to do
okay,
it.
okay,
But
okay.
if it's not built for that purpose and they want to convert it to some other use that is kind of dicey, it would give us a way to say, well, you're going to mess with the landmark too much and it's not conforming.
What's
so we're gonna
dicey?
Say no.
I mean, if it's in compliance with the code in terms of use, isn't that okay?
These are for uses that aren't in
all right,
compliance
okay.
with the code.
The other question I had, I know that buildings that are in residential use are not covered by this. Basically, that they can't convert to the original use if it's now in residential use or has been since 2014. Is
Yes.
that correct?
Yes.
Does that mean the whole building's in residential use or a portion of the building's in residential use? How's that work?
It's a good question. I mean, I would read that as probably we meant the building as in some, the resident, as the whole building as in residential use, because typically you wouldn't convert
Well, the way that came up
or
was
some residential use.
Huh?
Was it the Pally House?
Page 3.61.
Yeah, she brought up at the hearing, well, what about, and also, there were other buildings that were possibilities that could
Oh,
fall
where it
into
was like
that.
a hotel, for example,
Right.
and it'd be able to take over existing units. Yeah, I could see that.
Right,
yeah.
that was why we
That's
put
what I was
that in
thinking.
there, and, and that was kind of done on the spot, too, so maybe it was a little
Well,
hastier.
see, what kind of concerns me is you could have a building like the Pally House where half the units are short-term rentals, so they could be categorized as hotel, and the other half are long-term rentals. So that would be the residential use. How would you handle a situation like that?
Well, in that case, I think this says that you wouldn't be able to convert those
Okay.
residential units because that was a residential use. So
Okay.
you're converting that space that was formerly residential to something else.
Okay, thanks.
Commissioner McKinnon, do you have a comment on this item?
No, I wasn't entirely convinced by Mr. Kutcher that a CUP gives us control over it, though. If you feel that we need to strengthen that a little bit, then I would be okay with that. The suggestion, generally when a CUP arrives here, I can't recall too many being knocked back in my 8 years on this commission. Can you recall any? No. So, I
Well,
think
these are
came
different than
close on that childcare
CUPs.
no, but what he was arguing was that the CUP process is fine for that. It gives us all the control that we want. I'm not agreeing that that's right. I think we need some other things.
Can I ask, so, but,
Well,
one of the CUP's findings is about compatibility with the neighborhood? I mean, to me,
Yeah.
that seems to give us a lot of leeway.
And every other CUP is a use that is allowed with conditions, and these would be uses we would looking at that are not technically allowed. And so that compatibility finding would make a lot more sense to use. Are you telling secrets?
Yeah.
It,
Well, we can take.
we'll take a break in just a second. I guess I'm not as comfortable with the compatibility, right? Like I certainly understand the intent, but I also feel like it's hard to know what the integrity of the interior is. I
Right, maybe that's not the finding you want to add.
yeah. But is that
Right.
interior?
Right, and in the case of the one building that did use this, they gutted it before they applied for the use.
Okay, Tony.
So
do you have
you and your friends maybe could help us come up with maybe one more condition.
So the condition is intended to address the
preservation of
the preservation
Histor-
of the
in-
resource itself.
Right.
on the interior?
Okay.
What does
We'll
that do to
think
the
about-
Sears building?
Oh, they're approved, so
Okay, good.
yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we don't normally have jurisdiction over the interior of a landmark.
Yeah.
Is the issue, and I think we have to kind of think that through because
Well,
part
it's-
of the part of the continued life of a historic resource is to allow the interior changes that might
It's
occur.
not so much interior
Right.
as the structural volumes of the way.
You mean if they added like drop ceilings or something in a place, or splitting up the space?
Like got rid of a corridor or something like that.
Yeah.
is that what
Yeah,
you're saying?
splitting spaces differently, like the way.
You're talking about
I'm-
like the spatial
I'm trying to think of what
relationships
it's called,
within a building.
the bowling alley on Wilshire
Mhm.
and Fifth Street, and the way they. I was very uncomfortable with the way the second floor of that original historic building is like a faux floor. It's not a building. They made it into the patio for a new building that was sort of inserted behind. And to me, that is, that's an allowed use. So we, and right, but it was an adaptation to a new use that really messed with the historic building in what I thought was a very negative way. So, there are things that people do, and this would give us a little extra, and that isn't really about the interior. That's the way the exterior was.
Yeah,
But then that.
I'm just
sorry,
wondering, like,
go
where
ahead.
we have like an exterior change to any designated landmark, it's subject to environmental review always, right? We always look at whether there are adverse impacts to the resource, whether it's in compliance with the standards, and that would seem that that's a bar that's already there in terms of affecting the exterior. So if the conversation about the exterior, I'm not sure that is actually necessary because that would actually be part of the review. And again, the interior, that would seem counter to the desire to provide flexibility for adaptive reuse of the resource. So if there's no discomfort with the language, maybe this one just means we just don't change the language and we just keep
Let's
it as
just
is.
leave it.
I
Yeah.
think that's what we're seeing.
Okay.
Okay, let's take a quick break, but let's make it quick so we can get out of here. So maybe come back in 5 minutes. Great, thank you.
I think Dolly's doing a slow cooker or something.
Oh, okay. So I'll just bake something.
All right.
But the size of the coaches themselves vary.
Right, but the pads in my mobile home are traditionally, and in the others that I've ever visited, it appears to me that they were all standard. And maybe in the newer ones, they have larger, but they also have what, 400 square feet or something requirement, and you're parking there next to your awning that covers the pad. That's the new standard. I'm talking about traditionally.
Okay. Let me see if
But
Jack
there's
knows.
Okay, I would really appreciate that.
Well, now my kids are,
I mean, I really
well,
look
they
hours.
graduated.
Now, that's not my expertise. I'm doing good to send emails,
Right.
give me a break here, you know. But I would really appreciate that.
Sure, no
Thank you.
problem.
This place pretty cold, don't they?
It's like heaven, because I only have to do this stuff.
One of the other problems we have is that, like, the system we have for putting files away, meaning putting in the address file, remember good old address files? So, when he should have that with the files, but they got the original, but they got, I have one. But we got behind because our town, Melissa, has been doing scanning and putting it in an address file. And so doesn't get, she's not the only person here. So she locks up address file, it's password protected. All day, email her, you say, could you unlock it? 15 minutes is what I need. So last Thursday, last Friday, and part of Monday, Mauricia just like booked it, getting as much put in as possible. And on Friday I said, well, I need to just hang on. And then on Monday morning, which she did until Tuesday. But, and she only here 3 days. Did you hurt your body?
Yeah, I mean, they hit the ground, I mean, after years of ringing, oh, my heart, they were dizzy, but
Oh, right. Yeah. How'd you clear the room so well? A real well. Yeah. Also kind of sissy was like,
no, we had photographs of them.
well, you lost all the lawyers. Yeah. All left you like that. Elaine and I were talking about it, and she, it's like, if you come in here during the days. Yeah, they're starting with the 6th grade. And Miriam was gonna work on that. So, you know, the new space.
Okay, back to work. I just turned on your mic. I will have something to say.
I'm just ready.
Good. All right, we're going to call the the regular planning commission meeting of August 2nd back to order. We're considering we're having a preliminary discussion of changes to the zoning ordinance. So we're on item 21. Which regards requirements for bringing single-family home parking up to code with the addition of a certain amount of square footage. Commissioner Fresco.
This is one that is near to my heart because it has to do with neighborhood conservation, and I had suggested a while back that perhaps the standard where it's 50% or 500 feet be triggered when the house reaches a certain size threshold. And at the time, I had the number 2,000 square feet running through my head. And then when I look at the average size numbers that staff gave us, thank you very much, that seems like it's kind of fair for the much smaller sites like that one, where we're talking about houses that are 800, 900 square feet, and if they add a very small amount and then they have to add a garage that's bigger than their house addition, and it's crazy. So I thought I would suggest that threshold.
So that's an additional threshold to the other two.
So yeah, basically it wouldn't affect most houses north of Wilshire or Noma because the average house size is already bigger than that. So basically if you're doing an addition that brings your house up to 2,000 square feet or less, then it doesn't trigger the parking conformance. And we might want to add a little cumulative thing where people don't keep adding small. I guess that wouldn't matter as long as, yeah.
Because at some point you'd potentially get to the 2,000 or not.
Right.
Commissioner McKinnon, do you? Okay, Commissioner Lambert.
I just want to point out that when we look at the average size of these neighborhoods, that's including the mansions that are being built. I mean, frankly, I assume mansions, loosely speaking, the larger new homes are included in this average square footage.
That's right. Yeah, we just pulled this data primarily from assessors data. It's kind of the information we've got.
So when we're talking, for example, about Sunset Park, the prevailing older houses are probably 1,200 or 1,400 square feet. Maybe
less. They're a lot less.
Yeah, we could certainly do an additional filter based on like year built.
Yeah,
to try and weed out those versus the more recent ones. That's certainly something we could do.
I think we really want to encourage, and actually there's a good deal of add-ons in Sunset Park on older homes. So they've done nice facade treatments, and they've retained the scale of the original house. And I don't know how much square footage they added, but that is far preferable to the alternative. Right. So whatever we can do to encourage that, we should. I'm not sure where that takes me, but maybe what you're saying. I'm not sure 2,000 square feet may be what it is.
I mean, I've talked with some of these property owners. I get calls, people, I guess because their houses are old and they want to know if I think they should landmark them. But it seems like most of the houses that are really struggling with this are ones that are starting out under 900 square feet and are just trying to even get to like 1,700 square feet. So,
Commissioner McKinnon.
Fair.
Well, it's really this item that we're talking about, the item that's on screen 28, work together in the sense that people are looking at how they can stay in the house, increase the value of the size of the house, maybe with kids or grandparents, and then look at maybe even aging in place by putting this accessory thing at the back rather than just sell it and move or tear down the whole thing. And as we heard from a couple of our estimable people, that causes a problem, and it's a cyclical problem, where people are just selling out or they're just going to spec houses. So whatever we can do to allow people who are living in their houses to increase them to a reasonable limit. And if it's 2,000, great, let's start on that and see what Tony has to say. And then when we come to the ADU thing, again, we heard some testimony from Owen that new houses are multiple thousands of square feet, but you go to an ADU and you're not allowed to do more than 250, and that you know that they're not working in the right way. So this might be a step in the right direction. So I take your 2,000 square feet as a eminently sensible starting point before you trigger everything else that we want to be triggered.
Okay.
Can I ask a question? Why do we care if the parking is not in compliance with current standards? No, seriously, like...
I'll let Laura jump in too. That is actually one of the, it could be, I don't recall whether it's in bucket 3, is this discussion of parking in single family neighborhoods and whether it, you know, is this traditional kind of historic model of having it in an enclosed garage really necessary now, or are there other ways that we should look at how parking can be configured on a site? Is I think that was one of our new policy direction items, and Laura might want to augment that a bit.
Laura Beck, I'm the senior planner with the Mobility Division, and one of the issues that arises often when we're looking at building additions is the existence of parking that is no longer functional. So it's being used, or it's being attempted to be used. It's substandard driveways, or it's additions that have happened in the past that limit the maneuverability into a garage, and so it's just not an ideal situation. And we also we have had we have standards that require that where there's alleys, you take your access off the alley, and that is to improve the streetscape for pedestrians and bicyclists, limiting the number of curb cuts and driveways. And so those are all very important, policies for mobility policies. So it's not just the parking; it's the access to the site and where we put the cars, and people do have cars. So.
Thank you.
Commissioner Lambert. There's a number of new homes in my neighborhood that are remodels, loosely speaking. And they built on the footprint, so they do actually, even though they have alleys, they have garages on the street and curb cuts, because that's the way the original house was built. And I'm not sure if there's anything we can do about that, but it's happening. It's a remodel. I mean, it really isn't, but
if
that's...
It's, and so if it's not, our definition of substantial remodel, and if it's, it's so the demolition, thank you.
Right, it's a travesty. I mean, they kept the framing and they call it a remodel. But everything else is
probably
right.
My guess is they are probably approved under the prior code, and it takes some time for those construction projects
we don't
to
let
filter
that happen
through.
anymore.
We don't do that anymore. Yeah,
that's good. And I kind of agree with the chair in that, I mean, kind of like, who cares? I mean, most of the residential areas in my neighborhood and all over the city have preferential parking. So it's clear that residents are using for themselves and for guests, but themselves, the street parking.
Yeah, but look, I would argue, as someone who rides a bike around, that it's actually pretty important not to have a whole lot of curb cuts. I know this
I agree.
is a little different to what I was just saying, but there's a balance. But people will park on the street as opposed to their property if they have a chance to do it, because they regard that area outside their house as their property as well.
That's right.
We don't really want them parking on the street like that.
I agree with you, but it's happening all over the city.
It is, and that's why we have these standards which encourage people to have garages which they park their cars into, so on and so forth. So it's a balance issue between the need for housing and also the need for walkable streets and mobile streets. And I wouldn't like to dispense with them totally. And I think the R1 neighbourhoods would push back pretty heavily too.
One of the things that's in under item 21 tonight, some of the policy options is a little bit of a distinction that we wanted to get your feedback on. The difference between a property that has a functional garage and driveway that may be a little bit substandard, but yet it doesn't have access off the alley, and that being the only change, or whether or just that the fact right now the way it's written, the code section refers to the parking table, which just says 2 parking spaces. So we do definitely want to change that code reference to apply to the standards, because of the way it's written just implies that it can be interpreted that if you've got 2 parking spaces, even if you can't get to them, that it complies. So there are some nuances in the policy, but then a much greater issue about what's okay.
I also see no point in requiring a garage. I mean, there's no reason in my mind that you can't have a carport at the rear of your property coming off the alley. I mean, the garage nor the carport is visible from the street, so I don't see really any point in that.
And I think that's something that we've considered for policy bucket 3.
Yeah, that's on the list.
Okay. So anyway, we'll expect to see that minor language modification that you were just talking about.
Yes.
There was this, am I confusing my items here? There was this question too about whether this should be applying to all single family homes or just in the R1 district?
Well, and this is because it used to be it would use in the previous zoning ordinance, it was in the R1 standards, and now it's just under the single unit dwellings. And so then it captures all of Ocean Park, single family, the OP1 district. And so those are historically smaller structures. So I think that's maybe would be addressed by a different threshold that was 2,000 square feet.
Okay.
Did we answer all your questions in this item?
Yes.
So you're clear about what you need to do?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, item 22. Thank you, Chair. Distinguished use categories in R1 districts. Oh, right. Okay, sorry. I'm just catching up here.
Stick with it.
Should the enclosed garage requirements apply to all uses in the R1 and OP districts? Or should we potentially have different standards for those allowable uses in the R1 that aren't single family homes? Is that, yeah. Commissioner Fresco.
I don't think there's a reason why they have to be all enclosed, because I think we're just making people build more stuff on their lots and it's crowded. But I wouldn't want to see those parking spaces, having parking lots in front of daycares and R1 neighborhoods either.
Or bed and breakfasts, which I noticed.
Or bed and breakfasts, or, yeah. So, we just have to be careful about how they're required to be placed, and flows, and certainly taking advantage of alleys where they're available.
How many dwellings are we talking about, Tony?
How many non-single unit dwelling type uses? I don't know how many exist now, but it would also deal with future uses.
Are we talking, but is it 50 or is it 1,000 or 2,000? I mean, are a lot or just a few here and there?
There's probably, I'd say, throughout the city, there's got to be at least 30, 40, of these, sort of, whether it's family daycare use, because with the new zoning ordinance, we now allow early childhood education centers within R1 zones. We're starting to see this becoming more of an issue as we have childcare operators coming forward, with a proposal for that use. And then this requirement for an enclosed garage on the site is something that's not feasible given the other requirements. They're required to have outdoor play area, all the requirements that the state has with respect to a childcare facility. It's sort of at odds with that policy direction. So this is one that it's, evident to us anyways that it's probably wasn't meant to apply to those kinds of uses.
But it's not a huge number.
No. It's not a huge number, no. Right. I mean, I think we've only seen 2 or 3 applications in the last 2 years.
And these single family uses, is this a comprehensive list? The duplex, adult daycare, supportive housing, bed and breakfast, and
I think it's most of them, but we can take a quick look.
I feel like I would be comfortable with not requiring those uses to build a garage. right? Am I understanding this issue correctly?
Yeah, it would be like awful.
Yeah, those uses are pretty exhaustive.
Is the rest of is the commission okay with that direction, that we, for those non-single family uses, we just say they don't have to be in the garage?
And to be clear, the parking still couldn't be located within the front yard. That's still a applicable standard citywide, but it might give them flexibility to park along the side in the side yard or in the rear in an open, different configuration. So that just gives us flexibility.
Okay. Moving on to 23, about the minimum driveway widths matching the minimum apron widths. Any discussion? Make it right, please. Okay, 24. Oh, this is the
and or.
We're okay with that change, right? They don't have to meet all those requirements.
No.
Okay. On to item 25. Determine when required bike parking should be allowed on the public right-of-way instead of on private property. Commissioner McKinnon.
No, I was waiting for Commissioner Fresco.
No, Commissioner McKinnon.
Well, I think that it's not a good option for new building people who are building new buildings to suggest, as 501 Broadway did, that they should put the bike parking on the public right of way. That's unacceptable. They've got obligations to bike parking, pretty much end of story. And I'd also prefer not that they pay in lieu fees. Otherwise, they'll all opt out. Our job here is to try and improve multimodal ways of transportation. And it's not a build it and they will come. They're out there. They want places to park, and that's our job. So however we get to a position where buildings are providing more bike parking, I think is absolutely critical. And that'll be my driving theory over these next couple of bits and pieces.
Commissioner Fresco.
I think that especially for older buildings that are trying to retrofit to add bike parking, this is really important. I also think having bike racks instead of parking meters to lock your bike on is preferable, because those little signs on the parking meter scratch your paint. Also, I think having bikes on the street are enticing to people. Oh, look how easy it is to just park your bike out front. I think having some racks is actually...
No, but that's not the suggestion. The suggestion is that it be the public right of way, so it's in your sidewalk or some aspect that's not on their property.
Right, just adjacent to a parking meter.
Well,
like having a real bike rack instead of a parking meter. I mean, there's...
No, it will be more than that, and Laura will answer it, but it could be for a new building. For example, we did that medical...
No, not for new buildings. I'm saying it's only... I would only be okay with it for retrofitting old buildings.
So you're bifurcating it.
And the reason why the in lieu fee is preferable is because there's some places where the need for the bicycle parking may not be directly in front of the subject property, but is in the area, or maybe not. Maybe that area already has sufficient bicycle parking. One of the other things I want to draw your attention to is the current code right now requires that a change of use would have a minimum of the 4 parking spaces be provided on site, and additional parking could be paid in lieu or put off site. And so what we have also found is that some of the existing buildings, there's not space to put. There's no space left. Like Main Street, there's change of use, and there's no space to put those 4 bicycle parking spaces. And so that would be something else to consider, whether that if they're changing the wording quite a little bit.
But I think this works with the next one as well, which is that in some of why don't we allow the removal of a car spot and the installation of it? I understand in Main Street there are not those, particularly on the west side of the street, that's not going to be a possibility, but it's how these all fit together that's the key.
Well, this is just any required parking that cannot be placed on site.
Yeah.
We just want to get your input on that flexibility, or do you want that
I think the issue with
some existing properties that just are, we're having challenges right now.
And I think the other issue with allowing is that, as we've seen, we have new development interpreting this requirement and saying, I can put all of my required short-term bike parking not on my project site that I've just demolished a building and is completely empty, and that's just not an acceptable situation to us, that they're using the public right-of-way to meet their project requirements. That just is fundamentally not what the intent of this is. It's really more to address that kind of retrofit issue where you have existing buildings built property line to property line. And, so the standard in the code is that what we'd like to propose is something that it's infeasible to put it on there. And then the next step would be an in lieu fee. As we've dug into this more with the city attorney, about, having a private entity install a bike rack, it calls into question then the maintenance procedures. What happens if that bike rack needs to be replaced in the future?
Or if someone injures themselves on
or
the bike
something
rack.
Like that, right? And so, our preference is really to have the fee so that we install it and we know what the cost of a bike rack is, and
Right.
we can make decisions as to what would be appropriate.
And we have the fee in place.
Right.
So I think the only question about that is that when we force people to provide bike parking on their property or immediately adjacent to their property, then you get a spread of the bike parking. So what we don't want, I think, is to have 5 places on Main Street contribute in lieu, and somewhere on Pico at 34th Street get the bike parking.
Sure.
That's not the idea.
Right.
Because the more we spread the bike parking, the more people will use it. This evening at the pool, there were 5 cargo bikes there. And so clearly people are starting to ride around with their kids in these little bikes. And it's the spread of the infrastructure which will signal to people that that's what they should be doing. Now, what I hear you saying is there are exceptions, and because of the built environment, we can't actually physically put it in. How do we deal with it? And the second thing is there's this sharp developer action, which is to try and say, well, we don't need to do it because we've just demolished the building. Do your changes capture those two things that you've found?
I think they do, and we would probably need to think about this part about where the bike rack is located, because I think right now we say we have we collect the fee for it. It's an in lieu fee because they're not installing the racks on site. So I think reasonably they should be somewhere
in that
around that area. Right? It can't just sort of be in another part of the city.
But we do have programs where we're citing bicycle racks in the public right of way based on demand or citizens' requests. And so it may be that the city just installed 5 bike racks in the vicinity of that property, and it may be best to put some other bike racks someplace else. And I feel that we have the perspective to ensure that the bike racks are being installed where they're most effective and most needed. So I would recommend that we don't limit it geographically. That it's just an in lieu fee that is to be used only for bike racks, and I think it'll work out the way you intend it to.
I hear that respectfully, but what we do know with parking, for example, with Shoop, the Shoop argument is that when you charge people, you've got to put it back into that community so that community sees the improvements. And if I'm the owner of a building, it doesn't matter if I've got 5 racks outside, I want to see the money that I've just contributed go back into the community somewhere handy. So that's the alternate point of view on that. And I'm fighting a little bit on it because I wouldn't say that the spread of bike racks has been spectacular in the city so far. So, I'd like to see more of it. And if people are renovating buildings, great. Let's go for it.
Commissioner Fresco, anything?
I'm just thinking about the place I go frequently, and I use my Go Santa Monica app to show that there is not a single bike rack on the entire block. And so far, it's been months waiting for my rack.
Right. Perhaps take that up
And why is
offline.
your rack coming?
I don't know. I would like the city to install a bike rack on that block. That's all.
Okay,
Well,
and
you're talking
therefore
to the
it should
right person.
be.
I'm just planting
I guess
a
I would
seed.
say. I mean,
Pfleger is the person
I
who
could
goes
see
to
that
call.
there would be this issue, right, where if there are bike racks already in the vicinity of a project, why would we want to put more bike racks in that same place?
Well,
right?
I think that's a perfectly good idea. I would argue that that's exactly what we should be arguing with parking too. So there's parking spots all over the city. No building should have more parking. I mean, it's just not right. And the way people ride bikes is they ride to outside where they want to go to, they tie it up and they walk in. That's why you've got a bike, because you get around the cars and so on. So I don't want to be.
I guess what I'm saying is, right, that we don't have. Or I'm agreeing. We don't have enough bike parking, right? But if there's if there's parking that's recently been installed, then there's a benefit to the in lieu fee being paid, and so then we can build Commissioner Fresco her bike parking.
I do hear that, but I think it's sensible to try and get it into that community constantly.
So I guess I think I'm going to go out on a limb here and say the commission is all in agreement about just making a affirmative statement about new construction projects, the bike parking having to be on site, right? So now I think we're just exploring this question of, is it better to do an in lieu fee or to allow the property owner to do something on the public.
Past that, having listened to Laura, that yes, there is an in lieu fee that's necessary because of the buildings. It's a question of where you put it, where you spend that money, and I'm going to keep arguing that we should try and do it as close in that community as to where that project is. So when you hand your money over, you'll be able to say somewhere down this road is where we've put the bike parking.
Okay, is everyone okay with that direction?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. That was not clear to me, Commissioner Quinlan. I'm glad you clarified. Thank you.
I came to that position having listened to our excellent planning department staff.
Okay.
School me, basically, but I don't want to go.
Thumbs up to the necessity of an in lieu fee. Okay, we're going to move on to 26.
Perhaps Laura could tell me what we should be doing on this. Yeah.
Okay, 26 is about clarity on the reducing required bicycle parking. Thank you.
So this standard is intended to allow properties that have existing parking lots to convert one of their parking spaces to bicycle parking, and it was put in the code for that purpose. And one of the reasons we don't feel it should be used as a credit, and we think it should be moved to a more appropriate place in the code, is because we feel that the bicycle parking standards that have been added to the new zoning ordinance are appropriate to generate the amount of bicycle parking that we need, and that we think that this would just reduce car parking for additional bicycle parking that is without having that without necessarily meeting the goal of getting the appropriate amount of bicycle parking.
I'm not clear on that. I'm not clear by what you mean.
Well, it's so what's come up is that someone wants to change their use. They don't have any parking, any room to make additional parking. So they propose to provide bicycle parking in lieu of the car parking spaces. But it's not any additional parking. It's just changing one of the existing parking spaces, like a credit. And so that's.
Do they put in additional bike parking?
To put in additional bike parking in, but they're also required to put for their change. They're also required to put the code requires them to provide bike parking anyways. This is in addition to that.
Yes.
Now there's other uses for that we have in the code that we want to incentivize, and we don't have any other way to incentivize. For instance, car share or. Well, that's the one that comes to mind, and that's where we think, we should have a credit for that, because otherwise it's really hard to get that threshold of numbers of car share spaces that really make the system work. And we just don't feel that bike parking is in that same category. We feel that we've got the standards in place that will generate especially with the change of use and the new construction, and there's going to be enough bike parking.
I must say I don't see that, because we've had a couple of buildings. The one that Commissioner Fresco was talking about, the medical building on 21st, and there was the other medical building at the corner of 20th and Santa Monica, where the developer said, well, I'll put in some more bike parking, but I don't have to. You know that, don't you? I'm going to do the minimum number of spaces, and it's a 4 or 5 story building with multiple 10,000 square feet. And so I would question whether a zoning code that we wrote on this maybe 3 or 4 years ago is in fact in tune to where we want to be today. My question to you was, if someone shifts a use, are you saying that they are required by the code to put in 10 bicycle spots on top of what they're already doing, and they're saying, well, see, that's enough, and they're using that as a credit? Or
Well, the code requires for a change of use or an addition to that the bicycle you have to provide bicycle parking
Right.
for that portion.
yes, and
Yes.
they're asking, and they're saying that's we've done what we're required to do.
Then they'll do that, yes. But
Could
there
we let them-
oftentimes, if there's a change of use that has a higher parking requirement for automobile parking, that's when we're seeing that, I don't want to provide I can't provide additional car parking. I'm going to give you 5 bicycle parking spaces and take away a car parking space.
So why is that
And
a problem?
Because that's not, because we feel that
Yeah, I know
we're-
people drive, but that's not
Right.
necessarily the case. Why can't they make the case all the time?
we feel that the provisions in the code for bicycle parking are adequate.
I mean, we've got an architect, Mr. Metcher, who wrote to us exactly on these lines this evening. That's why I'm asking the question.
Can I just step in? So I almost feel like though that these are 2 slightly different issues, and one is a bigger policy question.
And I think where I'm speaking from is that it wasn't the intention of this code provision, so we haven't fully analyzed it, and that's why I keep going back to it's not a credit, it wasn't intended to be, but and we feel that our standards are good that we came up with for bicycle parking. So that's where I'm standing, sort of.
So I
on
don't
that
feel that
marshy
the
land.
standards are good. I feel reluctant about that, and that you keep telling me that is like, okay, that's an interesting point of view. However, the original issue that you brought to us, I totally get that, and I think we need to do something about that.
So Commissioner Fresco.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you guys are talking about 2 different things.
They're related,
Okay.
but they're similar.
Okay. So the change that's before us here is if you have if you have X number of parking spots and you've met your standards, and X number of bike spots and you've met your standards there too, but you think that they're not sufficient, you want more bike parking, you can put 5 bike parking slots in your parking spot. And that's what this item is about.
That's correct.
So there is a way to get more bikes and less cars with this. Now, if you think that basically I say not for new construction, but certainly for existing buildings, that would be a fine thing.
And I'm just going to clarify. All you're talking about is like changing the location of this.
That's correct.
Okay. So
but it's also because it's in that parking reduction section that we really want to be clear about the intention that it would clearly not be a credit, and Commissioner McKinnon is very clear that he would.
I'm
going to
jump. I'm going to jump.
Okay.
I'm going to move us on, which is I hope it's okay to say we're good with that change, and if you could add to the bigger policy question discussion this idea of credits for using bicycle parking as a credit for vehicular parking.
Right, it's a broader question about change of use and additions.
Everyone okay with that? Okay.
It won't be a credit.
Thank you, Laura.
That's one half of it. It's a substitution of bike parking for car parking.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a substitution.
So it's not like you could credit somewhere else and go, what's the upland needs?
Those Australians have such a way with language.
I miss Hank. He understood me.
The rest of us can't understand a word.
Okay. Number 27, about the alcohol-related uses and the lapse of rights.
Sure.
I'm okay with the position as put to us.
Yes.
I'm fine too, and I don't really understand the point that was made earlier. Basically, if you cease alcohol service for 1 year, your CUP expires. That's the way it is now.
Mm-hmm.
And what he was saying is if the remodel takes longer than a year, we should be understanding of that.
As long as you have a building permit, then
Why would it take longer than a year?
It can. Definitely.
I can't believe I asked
This is Santa Monica.
It happens on pretty much every change of use, actually.
Well, could I
Because
introduce you
the
to the
restaurant
planning
closes
department?
and they don't immediately
I got
start
it.
construction the next day. You have to find a tenant. They have to go through the permitting
That was a really
process.
stupid question. Okay.
But even I would say in other cities it takes longer than a year. So I don't think it's a Santa
West
Monica thing.
Hollywood, for example, and you know.
Can I just clarify too that what we're talking about is a CUP for an alcohol-related use, right? Because just to maybe slightly play devil's advocate, right? Like, is there a possibility that we have an alcohol-related use that doesn't have adequate conditions on it, and that's a reason we would want to push it to lapsing? Do you know what I'm saying?
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's definitely a consideration. In that is that the abandonment provision, doesn't trigger in that case, because you would only need the CUP if it's a new use or if it's one that didn't have one before. So yeah, it could certainly.
And I guess maybe that's the question, right? Are there restaurants serving alcohol that don't have CUPs because they're so old?
Yes, there are.
Uh-huh. So in that case, they'd have to come in for a CUP because there's no lapsing if they don't have it in the first place.
That's correct.
Do you think is there anything in the in-between where like the CUP is so old that it doesn't have the provisions that we like now? Or
I mean, an in between would be, instead of a 1 year, you could think about a different time frame as opposed to the sort of unlimited kind of, while it's remodeling, to sort of push it along. But that's a bit arbitrary, where you go 18 months or 2 years, for example, if the concern is that we do want to bring those sorts of non-conform, the ones that are operating without a CUP, to bring them into compliance and have operational conditions. We've probably encountered that kind of problem just a handful of times. Yeah, I think maybe once or twice, we've been some really bad actors. But for the most part, it's not really been an issue. I think what we're seeing is that this is more of a barrier for, might just be a restaurant that served alcohol, and it's sort of an unnecessary problem there. I don't know if we can distinguish between bars, nightclubs, and restaurants, maybe.
The only other thing that I was thinking of is by extending the period, you have to make a finding of, there is not an over concentration of alcohol outlets. So if you were to let it go for 3 years and the conditions or the circumstances change, that could be one repercussion. And maybe it doesn't matter here, but that's something that is unique to alcohol CUPs.
I see what you're saying, where the context is kind of changing around them.
Exactly. Which is maybe why it was limited to 1 year in the first place, but competing considerations.
Yep.
Yeah, this is really more in terms of the, because what we have for the non-conforming uses is we do have that remodeling provision. So it's sort of it's that still has the 1 year, but it does allow the use to be, as long as you're remodeling, so you're not suddenly in the midst of pulling or even in the midst of construction and all of a sudden, the time has lapsed.
Yeah.
So.
No, I was dealing with this just the other night. Any other comments? My opinion is, despite my question, is in alignment with the other commissioners. Okay. Sorry, I'm losing track here. So 28, maximum allowable size for the ADUs.
Tony, does state law say anything on this now that it's changed?
State law does mention that ADUs can be up to 1,200 square feet in size.
Actually, it's what it says is that it can exceed 50% of the existing living area with a maximum of 1,200 square feet. So there are two prongs to this.
Can I just clarify? Sorry.
That's okay, go ahead.
It could, we could set standards that allow it to be higher, right? I think this is like, if you don't adopt an ADU, then these are the ADU regulations that apply here in your jurisdiction, right?
Right.
there's a section here which basically says the section does not limit the authority of local agencies to adopt less restrictive requirements. It's a little bit counterintuitive because local agencies traditionally can adopt more restrictive than state law. But I think the intent here is to the extent that we adopt regulations that would limit the ADUs that would otherwise be built under state law, that's what we have to consider. So again, it's competing considerations between state law intent and local considerations regarding size.
Commissioner Lambert.
I just wanted to say again that if we do the 50%, that obviously discriminates against smaller houses and neighborhoods. I mean, 50% north of Montana could be a 2,000 square foot ADU, whereas in my neighborhood it'd be 500. And I'm not sure how we can deal with that.
It might not even be that. When we look at the table in your area, there are houses that are 700 feet, so it might only be 350.
Yeah, but that's the big houses that have been built. I mean, the smaller houses are 1,000 square feet.
No, but that's what I'm saying. In Sunset Park, the smallest house is 676 feet.
Right.
So that would be a tiny addition.
Right, exactly.
We don't want that.
Exactly.
As I said, the thing that was working earlier on about the maximum size you could adopt, we can go up to 2,000 square feet. Great. So what's a sensible ADU level through the city that's a bit less restricted than what we've currently had?
Well, 800 square feet.
Well, I mean, if we start with
2 bedroom, right? 2 bedroom ADU.
Yes.
800 square
Yes, it is.
800 going higher because, again, we have lots that are 11,000 square feet north of Montana.
Yeah, that's another good point. Lot coverage has to be considered too. So.
well, that will also kind of self-regulate
Right.
the size of them.
Right.
The thing that I'm concerned about is just what happens, in areas like north of Montana where you can build really, really big ones, and I mean they can really support, in theory, a substantial. It really will change the R1 feeling of a neighborhood. It could support a substantial family.
So
what about saying? I'm sorry. What about saying 50? The greater of 50%? No, not the greater. Somehow, like making 800 square feet, which sounds good to me, actually.
Making what?
800 square feet would be the maximum size. Is that what you were proposing? Is that
Actually,
a nice 2-bedroom unit?
no, I think, doesn't state law say it
Well,
can
the
be
state says 1,200.
1,200, right?
But we can say whatever we want.
Well, no, we can't.
I would just say that you need to be careful about imposing things that would make it more difficult to build an ADU. So to the extent that, and I don't know what that number is, but if the logic is that you want 2 bedrooms and therefore 800 square feet, that would seem to be less restrictive than the 600 square feet. So that would be going in the direction of what state law allows, rather than, for example, going to a smaller square footage.
But again, we're also caught with lot coverage. So, in Sunset Park, for example, you're not going to build a 1,200 square foot ADU because there's no room.
So 800 square feet's a good starting point. The real question is there are lots that are big, and I would assume that most of those north of Montana have already got a second dwelling on them that's pretty sizable, whether it's legal or not. But the question is if someone does want to build a place for their parents, or the parents who are in the main house want to move to the back area and let their kids have what's a reasonable size given the size of those lots and the houses? Is it 1,200 or is it 1,500? I don't want to seem strange about it, but 1,500.
Maybe you could do an or. So instead here it's more like a limitation. So in state law it says not exceed 50% with a maximum increase of 1,200. But if you had an or, which is 50% of the existing living area, so if you had a big house, theoretically, that means you could have a bigger ADU, or 800 square feet.
Why don't we say no event bigger than 1,200 square feet or bigger than 1,000?
Could do that. Then it's exactly what the law says, basically.
But there's got to be a correlation with the existing house too, so that you don't have like a gigantic ADU and a small house.
Right, and that's
but even if you have a gigantic house, a 1,200 square foot ADU is pretty, I mean, that's how big my house is. I live in, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Tony, did you have
It's
some?
not small. It's roomy.
Yeah, I mean, we're trying to make sure we maintain the single family neighborhood quality. We do have the design standards currently in the ADU section that require ADUs to be subordinate in size, location, and appearance to the primary dwelling. So we can also use that standard to make sure that the ADU is relative to the main house is still an accessory dwelling. So regardless of the numbers, there is also that limitation.
But isn't that overridden by state law? If someone comes along and says, hey, you know what, the main house is 800 square feet, but it says, you know, I want more than 400, according to these guys, they're allowed to have that.
I think state law might also, well, we'd have to check.
I mean,
see if
isn't
there's
Well, I mean,
language
they would
going
have to say that what we're doing is more restrictive. You know, the way the state law is written, and unfortunately, when state law is usually a compilation of compromise things. And so the way it's written, it says this section does not limit the authority of the local agencies to adopt less. It doesn't speak about more restrictive requirements. So then you have to go to analysis of whether it's an actual conflict with state law. And that's why I'm saying really to draw the line about what's a conflict is, would it prevent somebody from building an ADU that they would otherwise build if they didn't have this local regulation? You know, I'm sorry, that's like the most precise I could get about it, but that's sort of the way it is. And you know what? We won't know what the limit of that is until we get challenged. But the challenge would have to be, I would like to build this ADU. State law says I can do it, and your regulation is preventing me from doing it. So to the extent that we impose regulations that would allow them to build ADUs, they can't make that argument.
So I'd like to put forward that we pick a number as the number you're allowed to go to, whether it's 800 or 600, and we pick an upper number that, given the size of the house, it's no more than half or something like that. And Tony works on it, and then it will very quickly become apparent to us whether we've picked the right numbers. People will start saying, no, that's not impossible. It will overwhelm Ocean Park, or it's not enough for north of Montana. But at least we will have put out there, ADUs are coming. We see them as, given this generational change, which is a lot of people now want to keep living here but are prepared to move aside and move to a smaller dwelling, it's just a sensible thing to do.
So are you saying that we have an upper limit and then we have an upper limit?
Well, I think the real question is, okay, so let's say it's 600 or 800 as what you can build by right. The question is, how big is the biggest ADU you want to see?
I think what I hear you saying is, I hear you kind of giving direction to staff to kind of set a limit, but to explore this idea of, locations with larger lots. Do we allow for some more flexibility on those larger lots?
Yeah, although I must say I had a visceral reaction when someone came in and said they wanted to put a couple of 1,000 feet as a fill-in to one of their places on the 11,000 square foot house. It's like, really? I mean, is that really necessary? And so it's not carte blanche. It's what's acceptable. If you did want to go and live there, what's a reasonable size? Now, I live in 1,200 square feet, so to me that seems like large enough for a couple of people to live in.
Commissioner Frisco.
So what that leads, so then basically we're saying, I'm okay with 800 as the cap, and staff will fool around with the large sites, but then we have to address the tiny sites and the people who, are we keeping that 50% threshold in there, or is that going away so that if you have 1,000 square foot house, you can still build an 800 square foot ADU?
Well, you're governed by lot coverage.
Right. But, that whole percentage, I think in Ralph Metchard's letter, he brought up the idea for the ADUs where you're subdividing the main dwelling, and it has to be 150% of the spaces of the ADU is still part of the main dwelling. So, that leaves about 250 feet for a lot of these houses.
So Tony, the item or the idea that Commissioner Fresco is talking about, is it adequately dealt with what we've got in place, which is on small lots relatively small house, someone comes in and says, hey, you've said that I can go to 800 square feet, I want to go to 800. Now, Commissioner Lambert says, well, the lot coverage will cover that. Is that really enough?
Well, it may or may not. I mean, it could be a standard sized lot that has an extremely small existing home, let's say 1,000 square feet, and 800 square feet. Potentially that combined could still be within the lot coverage limits. The question is, do you feel that the 800 square feet could still be considered an accessory dwelling unit compared to the main house, or at some point does it seem like a duplex?
You know, when I read that comment, it occurred to me that he's really talking about junior ADUs, because that's what it sounded like, because he was talking about building onto the existing structure versus like a separate accessory dwelling unit, which has a maximum of, so if you're a junior ADU, it's, you know, maximum of 500 square feet.
Yeah.
Junior ADU, you don't have to build a separate bathroom, you don't have to build a full kitchen.
But I think
that's something that's in the state law, which is not mandatory to be adopted. So that's why we did not do it. Because
I think that's something different, though, is that the provision we have in our code where we allow not the Jeep, but the actual ADU to convert floor area within the main dwelling unit, and that you can't have the ADU be more than 150% bigger than the main dwelling unit. So it's this issue of like what's the primary use, you know, which is the primary structure on the property, and certainly that could, you know, we're in neighborhoods where we have smaller lot sizes, older homes, right? Yeah, there certainly could be a case where an 800 square foot ADU does potentially overwhelm, could be bigger than the house.
Maybe you've just identified the answer, which is that we go, it could be, let's say 800 up to a maximum of 1,300, but that it be no more than X percentage of the original home in terms of an increase. So that if you've got an 800 square foot original house, you can't have an 800 square foot ADU. It's got to be 80% or whatever it is. Now, on that, I would flick it to Tony and say, well, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, we've never had that hard kind of number to determine when it's no longer accessory. We've always gone with the standard that it's subordinate in size and location and appearance, and it's been a little subjective. So it's hard. I think it would be hard to put a number to that, because even with a number, appearance wise, it still may not seem accessory.
Right, if it's at the rear of the property or something and you can't see it from the street.
Yeah.
Amber,
did you?
Yeah, I don't want to key it to the main house. I mean, I think there just needs to be sort of a subjective look at whether it really overshadows the main house or not. And I'm thinking specifically of Sunset Park. I mean, obviously the houses there tend to be small, the pre-existing houses, and we're very close to the college. And that's like an ideal situation for student housing, an ADU. But you have to respect the fact that the houses, except for the big ones, are small. So I wouldn't want to see a limit on the size of the ADU based on the existing house.
Well, I think the other thing is, again, the generational change is that people who are 50s or 60s are going, okay, so our kids are growing up, we'd like to keep living in Santa Monica, so we'll move to the back. We need a certain level of comfort that we've been used to, and we can accept a diminishing of space, and then the kids can take the front, or somebody else can take over that front thing. There's a certain trickiness in this, but we've got to move forward on it. So let's pick some numbers and see.
Well, it sounds like everyone's relatively comfortable with the 800, right? And it also sounds like at least this end is comfortable with maintaining that subjective language with regard to judgment about whether the ADUs.
Yeah, I don't think the 50% has equity between the small houses and
I
large
think so
houses.
too, right? And in some ways, it's like a small house can almost better accommodate an ADU because it has more yard space.
Is there an interest in keeping, in terms of the subjectivity, because we don't have numbers, but it's size, location, appearance, those three factors are still acceptable to keep in? Okay.
I think so, and you'll have to work that through a little bit before we go forward as to how these two things play together.
Okay, I'm realizing there's policy topic B under this item, yes?
And C.
Oh,
And C.
Okay, number 28. Okay. Additional regulations related to the conversion of existing garage ADUs. Oh, right. The concern about someone building a garage new now and then converting to an ADU. Commissioner Fresco, I believe this is your item.
Yeah, and obviously people's circumstances change, so I think that just putting a date and barring all new garages from converting to ADUs is forever would be inappropriate. So I'm more comfortable with a delay, kind of an approach of 5 years, 7 years, something like that. Something so that it's like, oh, well, that's ridiculous. I'm not going to wait that long. My kids will be grown up and I won't need that giant playroom for them anymore. So
just to be clear here, what we're talking about is someone builds a new garage, and I think what I hear you proposing is they wouldn't be allowed to convert that new garage to an ADU for some period of time after it was built. Can I ask this? Commissioner Lambert, go ahead.
I think 5 to 7 years may be excessive. I mean, it's a balancing act. I mean, ADUs are meant to increase the housing supply, so we don't want to be too draconian about that. So maybe 3 years.
well, they can always build another accessory building.
Well, there's probably no room on the site to do that. Not in my neighborhood, anyway. I mean, it's hard for me to even imagine this. It seems kind of an odd situation that someone would actually do that.
We had a project like that come before us.
Okay. I don't see it as a major issue. But if you do, that's fine. But I think 5 to 7 years is kind of excessive. I would maybe 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, I mean, in this new world, does it really matter if they want to build a garage and then change it? I'm seriously
Well,
asking
it gives
the question.
them a way to get the ADU on the property line so that it's right next to their neighbors.
Yes. But aren't they allowed to do that anyway now?
Yeah, we were just reviewing the state law, and we're not sure that it actually allows us to put a time.
Yeah, we need to
limit
be
on
careful
there.
about imposing requirements that would basically allow somebody to say, you're not allowing me to do my conversion in accordance with state law. I mean, unless it's a real issue, and perhaps we could give it some time to see whether it is a real issue before we would want to impose something, and then we could put something on the record that we're trying to address a specific problem.
I think keep in mind it's not like the parking is eliminated. They still have to replace that parking on site somewhere. There's flexibility in how that parking is accommodated on site. I find it hard to believe someone would build a brand new house, a garage and a house to kind of go down this road. It's a very kind of roundabout way to do it when the law allows you to do it in a much more straightforward fashion. But maybe there is an unusual situation where someone builds a house and they're finding the need to do the conversion in, a year. And I think it seems like the law is intended to allow them to do that.
Okay, what I'm hearing from the city attorney, though, is some concern about imposing a limit on this.
Right, and in fact, that's the segue to the next thing, too. So, when we impose even though that's a laudable goal, which we understand, the fact is it's going to cause a feasibility issue, and therefore, I think it could be construed as something that is impeding the use of the ADU statute. So, same concerns.
I agree. I think that's really not a good idea. Plus, no one in their right mind would come in and work with the city and deed restrict their property.
Right.
Work with the city.
I think if we were, just to give some context to both, probably B and C actually, was when this was brought to the Housing Commission, it was raised in the context of, and we were still researching at the time, was if we established like a base standard of here's what you can do by right with the ADU, and it was like I hate to use this term, but like a tier 2 for the ADU, kind of like an additional level to incentivize if you wanted to go beyond this, to voluntarily go beyond that if you want a bigger size, that, there might be a deed restriction put on there. So it was an idea out there. And I think they actually gave us an example of, I think it was Sonoma, or something, you know, where this is a program they have in place. Obviously very different, you know, kind of context. Yeah.
But also,
yeah, that was the concept.
I think one of the issues about this is we started talking about this 2 years ago and a year ago. The law has changed. The state law has changed, and a lot of what we're talking about has been swept away. I do not know how you could put a deed-restricted ADU into place these days. That's not feasible under the state law.
Right, and you know, because of all the impediments, they keep passing more and more state laws to address housing. So it's only getting, frankly, it's ridiculous because, you know, now they're imposing penalties on cities and this and that, but because cities are not just straight applying the law, it's just so they're having to come back with all these permutations of how to get, you know, how to force people to do what they originally were intended to do through state law.
Sounds okay to me. Okay. Okay, we're going to move on to 29 then.
Okay.
Eliminate the administrative approval review for multi-unit residential in the Ocean Park zoning districts. Commissioner Fresco. Oh. Commissioner Lambert.
I just have a naive question because I wasn't involved when all this came about. What does the administrative approval process add to the multi-unit project thinking? I mean, what do you get out
Why
of
are
the
you
administrative?
asking me? Maybe
Because it's your shtick. What does it do that other multi-unit projects don't get? I mean, what is it? Design review? It's not design review because ARB does it anyway.
It's really just a code compliance check that we would otherwise do if it went straight to ARB anyway. So it is.
It's duplicative.
Yeah.
It's duplicative. Okay, that's what I thought.
So then, why do you have administrative approval? I mean, it's like when we have those DRs, those are just we just had them downgraded to administrative approval. So nobody talks to the applicant about how massing and uses are arranged in the project. Nobody has any conversation with them. They just go down the checklist and hand them the paper back.
Right. The administrative approval it's a black and white. Do you or do you not meet the code? You know, in terms of, is the use permitted? Do you meet all of the development standards? We definitely do have that preliminary discussion about design with applicants, you know, when AAs come through, but we would do that anyways if they were to go to an ARB. It doesn't just go straight to plan check. It has to go through design review. And the fact that the AA is required in the OP is quite frankly a technicality in the language in the code because the OP districts are not technically within the multi-unit districts. And that's the only reason that they are required to have the AA. There is not really any additional thing that we're doing with an AA that we wouldn't otherwise do if it went straight to the ARB. We would still do the code compliance check. We would still talk to them about siting and massing and design of the project. As part of design review process, we integrate those things together. But you know, at its core, the AA approval is do you or do you not meet the code, and it's absolutely black and white. There's no discretion involved in that.
So none of the projects that, none of the zones that are being addressed by this change are single-family zones that would not go to ARB.
No, yeah, AAs are not required for single family. It's only for multi-unit projects. Yeah.
I was given the impression, I did talk to some of my Ocean Park zoning committee mates who were under the impression, so I just want to run it by you one more time, even though you've already said it twice, that this added another layer that allowed more input to the applicant to ensure, but it sounds like it really doesn't, and it's a nothing.
No, it's just more, it's another fee. It adds time.
It's a fee.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's kind of unnecessary time to a housing project, quite honestly, at the end of the day.
Right, so this isn't something that's going to give us an opportunity for more review for those 3 condos that replace 7 apartments. It has no, okay, never mind, fine.
Okay, so I think we're all okay with that change. Oh, flipping my page too quickly here because I'm assuming number 30. Does anyone have any concerns about that?
Oh, I think that's a big argument.
Okay, so we're okay with 30 as recommended by staff. Number 31, I'm assuming everyone's okay.
Yep.
Yep.
32.
I just have a question about that. 'Cause we got
About
a letter,
31?
email, 32.
Oh, 32. Okay.
We got an email or letter, whatever, from DTSM. I'm not sure they understand. I mean, from my reading of the code, correct me if I'm wrong, there really are no differences in limited service and takeout in terms of what the requirements of the city are. They thought that by eliminating limited service reference in the code that we would be encouraging takeout, but I don't really see the correlation.
Right. I think kind of the bigger issue is that the definition of eating and drinking establishments actually includes fast food restaurants. And I mean, there's a variety of examples in there. It says, ice cream shop, yogurt shop, cafe, fast food restaurants, etc. I think it was a pretty significant source of discussion during the zoning ordinance update in terms of reconciling, our former the famous incidental food use, right? The restaurants, and in fact, we had like 3 different kinds of eating and drinking establishments, and those were reconciled with this new definition of eating and drinking establishment. I think the core of the issue here really is, and I don't think that it's completely without merit, is that within the downtown, which is I think their concern is like could a 5,000 square foot store on the promenade convert to McDonald's? And yes, I mean, the answer is yes, it could do that. And, is that's possibly an unintended consequence of this, and if that is the concern, that I think we would want to research, how we distinguish that, is it maybe we have a separate definition of fast food without going back to the kind of weird and confusing system that we had before? And, how do we identify the distinction between Carl's Jr. and Lemonade and Tender Greens, take away the names, and operationally they're not all that different, right? So it's a very challenging issue, but I think we understand.
Well, I think the
what
tougher one
concern
is that place on 2nd Street. Is it High Low or Hi Ho?
Yeah,
it's a hamburger place on the left-hand side, so we're going to let them open.
They
but
just
not
opened,
McDonald's.
yeah.
Yeah,
Exactly.
we know what the intention of the letter in downtown Santa Monica is to restrain national chains from entering Santa Monica and setting up. Can you actually do that? No, I mean, because that's the intent of what they've got here. That
You need to be careful because, like any exercise of police power, you have to have a rational basis. And so it's usually linked to something like neighborhood preservation, health concerns for obesity. So as long as you link them, there are cities that have passed these types of ordinances. However, you have to be careful because there's sort of an anti-competitive side to that. And so that's where you're sort of picking and choosing amongst certain businesses and giving a competitive advantage to others. So there's discussion about it. Ordinance have passed, which allow you to basically restrict, formulate chains, but you have to be careful about what's on the record, what the intent is, what you're trying to facilitate or prevent, or what's the public good, for example.
it's pretty hard. We already have a Johnny Rockets down there, and we have a
Yeah.
cheesecake factory, and there's a McDonald's just across the road
Right.
here.
Yeah.
They do have table service.
But there are others that don't. I mean, it's what I'm saying is the mix in there as such. It's pretty hard to restrain what downtown Santa Monica is trying to do.
I think one way we tried to do that with the zoning ordinance update was look at size thresholds as opposed to the type of restaurant. So the way the code currently is set up is anything over 2,500 square feet requires a minor use permit, which is discretionary through zoning administrator. So that was one way we attempted to address that.
And I think part of the issue is in downtown, we kind of lifted that. They just became permitted uses.
Oh, yeah.
Sure. So,
The DCD,
yeah, so
yeah.
there's, the downtown is a little different than the rest of the city. We got a little more flexible. So I think, the concern they're mentioning is valid. Yeah.
Well, I mean, we have an unusual mix in the downtown. But then there is across the city a concern about the proliferation of chains. But we've had this discussion before. There just does not seem to be anything in the legislative arsenal that we can stop it adequately. So where does that leave us with this item?
Oh, it's just a question. I don't really have any position on it, other than supporting staff.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, and then I think that leads us to 33, which is an adjustment to a definition to comply with to be consistent with state law.
So is that why we don't have any medical marijuana dispensaries yet, David? Because
of the definition?
Yeah, because of the definition. I recall this maybe, is it 3-4 years ago, passing this through?
No, we are working on figuring out the process for
okay.
those two CUPs that the Planning Commission
in the narrowly defined areas
yeah.
of the city.
We're
So how
scheduled
those would
to
be
go to council October the
10th,
right? It's bringing back information at their direction on a process, options for a process for the selection of the 2 medical marijuana dispensaries in the city. And we've put this item here, but it's really going to be part of a broader thing because the law around medical marijuana changes. I mean, it's almost on a daily basis. And, the definitions we have in the zoning code now do not encompass anywhere near the breadth of the uses that, the state is allowing. And it's very detailed operational conditions and what have you. So we need to implement all of that within our code when the changes kind of stop.
Yeah, because I can recall we were well ahead of everyone else.
Yes, yeah.
At the moment we discussed it, and now I feel as if we're
completely behind. Yeah, we are.
And completely inadequately behind.
And we're not the only jurisdiction in that bucket.
A bit surprising for Santa Monica, though.
Okay, so that wraps up 8A. Are there future commission agenda items? No written communication, no public.
Could I ask a question? Yes. So bucket 3, when's bucket 3 likely to start emerging, Tony? You thought you'd got off scot-free, didn't you?
When we finish bucket 2. And that.
So it's taken a year for bucket 2 to get from last year to here?
Not a full year, no.
What was that date, Commissioner Fresco, did you say? August the 2nd or August the 1st? 364 days.
Not a full year.
So leaving that aside.
But the technical review of bucket 2 with the reso intent didn't start till later in the year.
So when are you thinking? 3rd quarter, 4th quarter? Well, we're 3rd quarter now.
For us to get to bucket 3 or to finish bucket 2?
Well, bucket 2 first and then bucket 3.
That's a tough question. Some of these we can do fairly quickly, and some of these it looks like we'll need to do some research, talk to people. So
I think on the previous occasion I made a suggestion, and I'd like to make it again, that if you can get a bracket of 8 or 10 done relatively quickly, why not bring that resolution of intent through and then move it so that we're at least getting things moved and changed, and the harder ones you leave.
Yes, that's not a bad idea at all.
I mean, the quicker the better.
And we make recommendations to council, right? And then the council adopts. And okay.
But it does seem some of these are impediments to the way things are operating. So let's fix those as quickly as possible. The ADUs, I think, might take a bit longer for you.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
We'd have to look at the calendar for returning. We'd have to actually come back first with a resolution of intention to kick off the formal.
Well, we have an open date in 2 weeks if you want to do that.
No, that one was cancelled, right?
Yeah.
We could get it back on.
No.
But nonetheless, I think a schedule that moves things forward would be useful.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, we won't sit on this.
Okay.
Okay, we're adjourned. Thank you. Thanks, Tony. Thanks, Laura.